Alrighty, we are back with another Q&A. I've been calling these Discord Q&As, but actually this one, there's a decent number of questions that are coming from DMs as well. I will be honest with you, if you're sending me DMs, I'm getting so many these days that it's really like not possible for me to make my way through all of them, but I did try to get through some of them at least and pull some questions out that I thought would be good. But yeah, if you want to get your question answered, I highly recommend the Discord. I actually do look over all of the questions that are posted there in the channel for this. Yeah, anyway, uh, let's get right into it. This was an interesting question. I thought it was like basically the person who was asking this was talking about like, hey, look at these juggernauts. You know, you look at like Urgot, you look at Set. For the most part, like even Garen has his ultimate, right? Like, why doesn't Darius have max health damage, right, or some form of anti health, right? And it's saying like, hey, it can be difficult to deal with like Heartsteel, or you get mitigated pretty effectively by Heartsteel as Darius. The short answer to this is that not all champions are the same, right? Like not every AD carry has an AS steroid, right? Not every assassin has a blink, right? Not every fighter has a stun, right? Not every fighter has a, melee, like has a really powerful steroid that makes it so that standing next to them is dangerous, right? Um, while there are things that we generally add to kits, in certain classes to make them more functional, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single kit that has to, in that class has to have it to function, right? Darius has true damage on his ultimate and percent armor pen on his E, right? He is better against armor than other Juggernauts, right? Like, as an example, Malphite is pretty easy to kill as Darius for the most part, right? It's like, obviously, he can ult away from you later on in the game, he can slow you, but like, if you're actually hitting him, you'll kill him pretty quickly, right? Comparatively to a lot of the other juggernauts who, tend to struggle actually killing a Malphite, right? Conversely, like a Heartsteel, Skarner or something like that is harder for Darius to kill than for like Set or Urgot or something like that, or even Garen, right? Um, and I think generally these differences in how different members of a class interact with the specific mechanics of their of their typical opponents. I think this is good, right? Like to take an example of another class, where it's like look at mages, right? Like which you can divide these into like artillery mages, control mages, burst mages, right? And it's like okay, so you could take a random mage, like say for example Ziggs, right? How much range your opponent has matters a lot as Ziggs, or I guess Lux is probably a better example because she's just a uh, more commonly played champion, right? So like let's take a look at Lux, right? It's like Lux E cares a lot about the specific range that your opponent is playing at, right? Uh, and so if you're playing against another artillery mage, Luxie is actually not a very good spell, right? Because it actually doesn't have the same level of range. And this is why, like, some people I think would consider Lux to be a true artillery mage. Some people wouldn't. Some people would consider to be like somewhere between artillery mage and burst mage, right? I'm not super interested in the distinctions here, just using this for the sake of discussion. Lux E, because of its lower range comparatively to the other artillery, the true sort of artillery mage bread and butter spells, this is like Xerath Q, Vel'Koz Q, Ziggs Q, makes her distinct from those other champions and makes it so that she has different interactions and she interacts differently. And using artillery mages as an example, one of the problems we've consistently run into is that they don't have enough differentiation, right? Their mechanics are actually too similar. This is why Ziggs has all of his tower destroying stuff, and why Xerath has his ultimate pushed so hard in terms of power budget, so that he's like, oh, he has a semi global, and that's like part of the thing that he does. And like Vel'Koz has his so much power budget in his ultimate where he just like can actually 100 to 0 people, is because that makes him different from the other artillery mages, right? Anyway, looping back around to the Darius example, the fact that Darius is better against armor and worse against health comparatively to other juggernauts, I think is pretty desirable, right? He's really good at beating down people who have a lot of armor. Okay, that makes him different, right? Like that means that he has different matchups. He has different context on the way that he interacts with people, even later in the game. Now, one thing I will note about this is that Well, I think from a conceptual standpoint, it makes sense that we have some juggernauts that have more anti-armor mechanics and some juggernauts that have more anti-health mechanics. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all tuned correctly, right? Uh, Something I'll note here is that, like, all of these mechanics have, were made, or well, not all of them, but most of these types of mechanics and this kind of like structural design was done before the durability patch, which did add armor per level, and various a stats package to everyone. And it is possible that this balance isn't quite correct anymore, right? Maybe Darius is actually supposed to have a bit more flat damage on his W or something like that, and his percent armor pen and his E should be lower, right? I'm not saying that that's true, but it could be, right? Something that I think that you may have seen if you pay attention to the patch notes is like we've actually done a lot of changes to lower armor per level, because some of the effects of that in the durability patch I think have been undesirable, but making percent armor pen very powerful, and making flat armor pen not as powerful as we'd like. But it is definitely possible that, like, structurally Darius's kit could have the numbers placed slightly differently, and it could end up being better, right? Like, something like, hey, actually in the modern day, in order for Darius to correctly be able to deal with a tankier target, his W is supposed to be a 1 second lower cooldown at max rank or something like, or maybe even at all ranks, so that he has the proper tools to deal with a durable target. That having been said, I'm not like a huge Darius player, but like my perception is not that Darius actually has problems dealing with a Heartsteel target, right? Darius is a really interesting champion because like he is sort of the Juggernaut in the sense that, like, his passive I think is very well is very emblematic of the way that I think Juggernaut should function, which is that he is inevitable, right? If Darius hits you 5 times, he is going to win that fight, right? Almost every time. Right? Obviously, there are extreme cases where it's like, oh, Darius, got 5 stacks, but he took 80% of his health getting there and only did 20% of his opponent's health, right? For whatever reason, right? Like, as an example, you can see things like that happening with, like, Fiora, right? Where the Fiora is like dancing around the Darius and, barely getting hit or whatever, right? Anyway, that's not important, the exact examples. But for the most part, if Darius is allowed to stack his passive, he gets to win, right? If he's level 20, for example, I think he gets like 280 AD, right? It's just a crazy amount of power. And then his bleed, does a crazy amount of damage. You had to 5 stack someone, and then you have a million AD, and his bleed actually scales with AD, right? So to me, there's no particular reason why Darius needs max health damage. But if there's a statement that he's not good enough at dealing with a durable target, that suggests that structurally he's not inevitable enough, right? His passive isn't powerful enough, or his passive isn't giving them the right type of power. And again, I haven't I haven't done any deep investigation here, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence that this is true. Like, to me, when I play Darius and I interact with like a Sejuani or Skarner or whatever Heartsteel champion, I'm like, yeah, they do take longer to kill than a tank that's stacking a lot of armor. That's just how the mechanics of his kit work. But I still generally find that if you get to 5 stacks, you're gonna win, right? Like, you're gonna kill them a lot of the time. And so I'm not super overly concerned with Darius having specifically exactly the mechanics that he needs to counter an item that wasn't in the game when his kit was made. So that's kind of my perspective on this. Is like, why doesn't he have it? Because we want the various juggernauts to have differences in their kits, and Darius doesn't need percent health damage to function. He already has the inevitability that he should need. And if that's not working, then maybe we need to reconsider exactly how powerful his passive is. All right. So I queued up a couple of Stormrazer questions here because I thought it was interesting. The first one is pretty simple: is Stormrazer due for a nerf? I took a brief investigation into the data, which suggests, I think, that I don't know if I'd say due for a nerf, but I would say long term it is likely to get nerfed relative to the other 80 carry first items, right? Unless something changes, which is always possible. Based on the current data, I think it is probably a little over, probably somewhere around like 1-ish% too strong, maybe 0.5% too strong. It is a very strong item. One thing I will note is that we do expect the harder to build 80 carry first items, right? This is Yuntal and Stormrazer, to sit at a little bit higher win rate, because completing them first item Similarly to if you've heard me talk about like expensive first items also have higher win rate, or expensive items in general have higher win rate. Completing the item means you're more likely being successful, right? Because if you bought a BF sword, that means you're more likely to be successful in lane. You somehow got 1,300 gold, right? You didn't pivot into Kraken Slayer or Collector or whatever, depending on your champion. And that means that you are, on average, more successful in lane, right? In a similar way to like a more expensive item means that you had more gold when the game ended, right? Because games end, all the time, right? If you're really, really, really far behind and your team FFs at 15, you might not finish a first item, which means that finishing a first item, like having a first item in your inventory when you're looking at item data, for example, if you have a first item in your inventory, regardless of how expensive it is, that means that it's you're not having the sample of games where that champion was extremely far behind to the point where they didn't have a first item and they FF'd at 15, right? As an example. And you can extrapolate this to basically every game state where someone is really far behind, they're less likely to have an item completed, right? So similarly, you can extrapolate this to items that have a tougher build path are probably like are slightly are going to be slightly higher win rate at balance. But that having been said, I do think that Stormrazer is probably a bit too strong currently. And long term, I wouldn't be surprised to see it nerfed a little. And then talking about some other things here is like, does the AD plus energize function require such a horrendous build path? No, I don't think it does. AD plus energize, like, and I'll read the rest of it. Does the energize plus AD output have to be on a rule-breaking, genetically oversetted luxury item? Short answer is no. It doesn't have to be. But I think this leads into a more interesting discussion of the energized system. So something that I don't think is really visible to players at all is that behind the scenes, we've actually done a number of explorations on larger scale versions of the energized system, right? You could see this long in the past when there were the Shiv plus rapid fire cannon builds. This was back in like season 6, maybe? I don't recall. It was a long time ago. But that was a build for like Vayne and Caitlyn for a while, where you would build, you would stack energized items. And over the years, internally, we've tried building out vertical energized systems where you could build a lot of energized items and they synergize with each other, right? Like RFC in the past used to have a line of text that says your energized effects stack faster. And Fleet Footwork was also this, right? Like Fleet Footwork having an energized effect in the keystone slot was intended to lead into a potential energized build originally, right? When we did Mythics, there was exploration on a vertical energized system with more items. When we did the season 13, I think it was mid-season 80 carry item update, there was a big exploration on like a vertical energized system. This has been something that's been explored a lot of times over the years, like very frequently over the years. And the theory of there being this like really compelling like energized capstone or vertical energized system, or like a system where you can build multiple different energized items and have them synergize and do something cool together, the fantasy is for sure there. However, at this point, seeing how frequently I've seen so many times this has been attempted internally and even externally, right? Like talking about the Shiv RFC build that was around long in the past. I'm pretty skeptical that these builds, like that a strong vertical energized system actually makes sense in League for two reasons. Number one is that loading a lot of power into one auto attack degrades a lot of counterplay, right? One of the similarities that the crit and on-hit builds both share is that they want to attack people multiple times and they want to, hit you over a period of time. Obviously, as they get more and more attack speed, they need to hit you for less and less time because they, damage scales better than durability in League of Legends. And so over time, they don't need to hit you for as long, but they still need to hit you for multiple auto attacks, right? Which gives, windows of counterplay because you have to stand still to auto attack. It means that there's a window of time for people to actually interact with you. And, especially it means that, your range actually matters a lot because like if you're Sivir, that means that we can tune your kit around the fact that you're really low range. So, for Sivir, we give you a spell shield because you're really low range compared to other 80 carries. And that's an appropriate tool for you to have. The problem we run into with the energized stuff in this space, right? I think number one problem with vertical energized system is that one attack being, even 90% as powerful as in terms of build strength, as the crit and on hit builds, is really, really, really low gameplay, especially when you consider the fact that RFC is guaranteed to be one of those items, so the attack is always coming from enhanced range. Um, it becomes really difficult for us to tune these systems to be satisfying, and also have appropriate gameplay, where your Caitlyn goes a full energized build at 3 items, can energize, tap someone with the with a headshot for 80% of their health, and it's like, well, that's how it has to be balanced, right? Even regardless of kit bindings, right, like Jhin fourth shot and Caitlyn headshot are like specific autos that are more powerful than others. Even outside of those, right, like Vayne autoing you one time from extra range for 50% of your HP is really, really, really hard for us to tune, and especially tune like Vayne's kit for, because it's not really a strength that she's supposed to have. She's supposed to do a lot of damage, and so whether she's doing that with crit or on hit is like, well, from a kit perspective, it's not that different, right? Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that like it's very hard for us to have a version of the first like one auto every so often is really, really powerful, that is acceptable gameplay wise, and we can actually tune kits around. Number two is it's hard for us to, like, I think the other problem with the energized verticals is it's hard for us to make those builds actually meaningfully different from crit and on hit, right? Crit and on hit already have problems being differentiated, right? They both make your auto attacks do a lot of damage over time. They build attack speed, so your auto attacks get scaled. And they both enhance your auto attacks to do more damage, right? How they do that is a little different, but the actual end outputs are very similar, which is why we've made items like Wit's End, for example, or even Terminus that say like, hey, the difference between on hit and crit is that on hits get more complete items. They get to be more structurally complete at 1 and 2 items. They don't have to scale as hard because they're not as multiplicative, and they get to buy defensive purchases. And in exchange, the crit builds get to scale way harder, right? Because they have more multipliers. The vertical energized builds we've had, one of the biggest problems we've run into, besides the gameplay health ones I was just talking about, where it's like, well, loading all of that power into one auto attack is really hard to tune around certain champion kits. And one of the other problems we've had is that it becomes very difficult to like actually tune these, because like, well, RC is an attack speed item, right? You're going to have a bunch of attack speed and AD and crit. These items need to have stats. And so it becomes very difficult for us to make a structure where you don't also, where you don't have the super special one auto attack, and then you don't, and then, well, you also are going to have like, 70 to 80% the DPS of a critter on hit build. And so it becomes very hard for us to differentiate the builds where it's like, well, you're getting like auto attack bursted. And then even if we make the DPS appropriately lower than the crit and on hit builds, you're still going to have pretty meaningful DPS. And then the next auto attack is going to come up pretty quickly, right? We've tested versions where Energize is a much longer cooldown, right? It requires a lot more stacks to build up, but people generally find that to be unsatisfying. And so at anything close to the current cadence where the auto attack comes up pretty frequently, it becomes hard for us to actually make the DPS meaningfully lower than the crit and on hit builds. And so it becomes very hard for us to differentiate those builds where it's like, okay, we created this entire new vertical system, but what it is basically a crit build where a lot of your damage gets loaded into the first attack, which is hard to differentiate, and then becomes like kind of not super compelling as a whole new build option. So let me wrap around to the actual question here. And I've talked a lot about vertical energize, which is not really what this person was like, exactly what this person was asking about. But why is AD plus energize on this, right? Like basically asking about, could we, the sort of implicit question here was like, could we get a AD stat stick with an energized effect that doesn't have attack speed that would be more broadly accessible? It's like, yeah, the answer is maybe, right? At the end of the day, I think that the explorations into the vertical energized, at least with our current structure of crit and on hit, are kind of doomed. I don't think it makes sense for us to add more energized items to the game unless they have individual merits that allow them to stand on their own outside of the context of Stormrazer and RFC. And damage is something dangerous because we already have 2 energized effects that deal damage. And so, adding more that would allow them to stack seems kind of dangerous to me, where we might be getting into the territory of like, oh, this is really just a crit build where you gave up 5% of your DPS or 10% of your DPS or whatever, but you load a ton of damage into your first auto attack, which is just like, the same thing but worse gameplay, for in a lot of cases. And so my answer to this is like, is there an alternate, or like, if I reconstruct the question of like, is there an alternate version of the AD carry system where there is a pure AD crit or AD energized item that is like Stormrazer? Yeah, I think I could construct a system like that. That's not how Stormrazer was constructed, right? Axis, who's the one who re-added Stormrazer to the game, really, it basically felt like, hey, Stormrazer was something we had in the past. It wasn't really doing any harm. We removed it because it was low pick rate, and we didn't actually want to make it super powerful. And it's like, well, if we're more willing to accept in the modern day lower pick rate items, as long as they're doing good things, they're not causing harm, which we are. Why not re-add Stormrazer? And like my perspective on that was like, yeah, it sounds good, right? Like, it just kind of sounds like a free roll. We didn't deeply consider what is the best possible version of Stormrazer. Maybe it is an AD crit item. Maybe it's an ADAS item with no crit. I'm not really sure, right? This is something where Stormrazer was re-added without, the goal of re-adding Stormrazer was, hey, are there any older items we could just kind of bring back without, doing a bunch of deep analysis on what they'll do to the item system, like items that we already know what they'll do, right? That's how Stormrazer came to come back into the game. And so, yeah, I think if someone were deeply considering the AD carry system again in the future, which, we do that every, on average, like every 1.5 years or something like that. The next time someone's deeply considering the AD carry system, I wouldn't be surprised if the question comes up of like, is Stormrazer's stat line the right one? And I don't know the answer to that question, right? I think it's an interesting one. All right. Why does Gunblade have split vamps? This is a question I threw in here because it's just really fast and really simple. It doesn't. It has Omnivamp. So we changed the rules for Omnivamp. If you're looking at a version of Gunblade with split vamp, you're looking at a version that was on the PB for like a week or something like that. When the this season's patch first went to PB. So it doesn't. It has Omnivamp with new rules. If you want to look at that, take a look at the patch notes and check that out. All right. So this was a question about Hwei. There's a lot of text here that I cut down, talking about like mid laners and side laning and like how this affects designing new champions and like how we understand side laning. And there's a really interesting topic. So I'm going to answer I'll talk about the Hwei thing first, and then I'll talk about the other thing because I think it's actually interesting in a way that the person who was asking this question probably didn't realize for this particular season. There's a interesting topic here. So talked about Hwei, was like their point was like, hey, Hwei's like 49% win rate, not in pro. What's going on with this champ, basically? Short answer is that we use mastery adjusted win rate, right? And so Hwei is a champion who's not super easy and is often played by people who don't have a lot of mastery on him. So Hwei, as an example, actually, there's a comparison to Yone here, where Yone is a more extreme version of this, but Hwei is definitely an example of this, where Hwei's win rate is actually slightly suppressed by players who don't have a lot of games on Hwei playing Hwei. Hwei, if you put in, I don't know what the exact number is, I didn't actually check, but I think it's something like 25 games. If you put in 25 games, actually, very competitive with other mid laners, and in fact, actually is more powerful than them in a lot of cases, if you're willing to put in the games, right? He scales better with games played than most other mid laners, and especially most other mid lane mages. What this means is that while he is 49%, the win rate is not the end of the story here. Much like how Yone is, I think he's like 48 right now. But if you put 30 games onto Yone, you will win an appropriate number of games comparatively to other, similar champions, right? Or, whatever the number is, right? I don't take the number as the exact rate. I don't have that number off the top of my head. But some number of games that is not that high. You'll win a fairly appropriate number of games. And if you play more than that, you might win slightly more than that, right? Like you can actually, get more power out of these champions if you are willing to put in the time and invest and put in the mastery, right? And this is an interesting topic because, in some cases, right, I want to be clear here. It's like, if the problem is you're not satisfied playing Hwei, you don't like playing Hwei, that is a different topic, right? Whether Hwei is appropriately powerful or not is like, could he be buffed slightly? Yeah, maybe, right? Almost any champion has some room, right? Like, except for the top, like very top of the table champions. A lot of champions have room that they could be slightly stronger. But if the complaint is, I'm not satisfied playing Hwei, that is different than Hwei is not sufficiently powerful, right? Because the reality is that he's within a fairly acceptable range of power, right? It is really funny. People are complaining, like even like disregard the mastery skewed thing. If Hwei is 49%, right? Like let's suppose he's actually 49% for people who've played, 30 games or whatever. And actually you have to play 70 games to get above 50% or whatever the number is, right? It's like, to me, that's not even really offensive, right? It's like that means that he's like slightly weak, but absolutely still playable. This is something I was mentioning in one of my previous Q&As. I think the last one is like, it is always kind of funny to me hearing people talk about like, this champion is really is so weak and useless, and it's like I look and it's like they're 49%, right? Even disregarding the mastery adjustment. It's just like, okay, come on, like 49%, like even if a champion's actually 49%, that is totally playable. They might be a little weaker than other champions, but that does not mean by any means that they're unplayable, right? Like, just get good, like we're not talking about like 10% win rate missing where it's like, well, yeah, okay, if a champion's 40%, right? Like, okay, look, that's not, I wouldn't call that playable, right? Or at least that's certainly not powerful, right? But when we're talking about small win rate gaps, like it's kind of surprising to me how quickly players latch on to like 1% off as being like something that's like not playable or like not acceptable. Anyway, not saying that's what the person who's asking this question is saying. It's just like it's something that always comes up as surprising to me of like players latching on to these very, very, very small percentage differences where it's like, well, the camp is for sure still playable. Anyway, going back to what I was talking about before, where like if the problem is satisfaction, I think that's a separate concern, right? And this is something that I could certainly empathize with. Or like, I'm not a huge Hwei player or anything like that, but it's like, well, if the problem is, hey, I feel like this, these spells or like this interaction is not, powerful enough, right? It's like, one of the things with Hwei that, I cautioned Misery, Hwei's designer, when he was working on it, I was like, look, options are power, right? The fact that Hwei has 9 spells, even if he only gets to use 3 of them at any given time because he has cooldowns that are shared amongst them, it's like options are powerful. And so one of the things that I said when he was working on this version of the kit, and I think he did a decent job with this, not saying this is his fault at all or anything like that, it was like, you have to make sure that the options, like the different options that are being offered are like actually feel really satisfying in the situations where they're optimal. And I think the W is a really good example of how, this is, I think that Misery did a really, really, really good job on the W in particular, where the W options are very different. A shield, a speed up, mana refund, and damage, right? Like, oh, like that, like it's very clear. Like when you get a good cast of one of these, it's often very clear that it was a really, really, really good cast of that spell, right? Like you use the speed and catch up to someone and kill them. Awesome. You got a lot of value out of that. You use the mana refund a bunch in lane and you're able to keep casting your Q. Oh, you were, cycling your mana refund correctly. You use the shield and save your teammate from a dot or whatever, right? Like, oh, of course, you used the right spell. I think it's a little harder because all of his Q's spells deal damage. It's like, there are some really clear success cases, but on like QW in particular, I think. But with Hwei specifically, I think it's hard because not all of the optionality manifests as really deeply satisfying power in the same way that the W does. I think the E in particular, where it's like, well, these are all CC, and there are some really clear, compelling use cases for like EE, right? Like the pull together. But I think it often is hard for players to differentiate like when it was a good cast of EQ versus EW, for example. Like the differences there are kind of small, and it's tough, right? Like CC spells don't have as much room for variance as the utility effects on W. And so I wonder if at some point in the future, if for whatever reason Hwei isn't feeling satisfying enough, one of the things we might want to do is try to differentiate his spells more, so that when you pick a different option, it is more clear why that was good or why it was bad. Because I think that's where a lot of the satisfaction for Hwei needs to come from, because that's where a lot of his power comes from, is that he does have far more options available to him at any given time than any other mage in the game, right? Because he just has more spells, right? And so that's something where I wonder if if we did end up in a problem, I don't know if this is actually true or not, but like if we did end up in a satisfaction problem with Hwei, where like, hey, is he not satisfying enough? Do we want to try and push the differences between his spells. Like, maybe, EQ is supposed to be more reliable but less powerful, and EW is supposed to be more powerful but less reliable, and it's only a CC follow-up tool for your allies or whatever, right? Or it's only a zoning tool. Right. Whereas right now, it's like there are situations where someone is just running through a choke point where you can just EW them, and it's actually just better than EQing them, because it's just a longer CC. Those are the kinds of questions I'd be asking if someone was like, "Hey, drop everything you're working on. You need to improve the satisfaction of Hwei." Those are the questions I'd be asking. I mean, obviously, I'd talk to Misery first and get his thoughts, but that's kind of where my head is at with Hwei. Is like, are the different the actual different options appropriately sharp and appropriately powerful in the situations they're supposed to be good, to make it feel satisfying when you click, when you get the right spell in the right situation. Anyway, I spent a bunch of time on the Hwei question, actually more than I was kind of thinking I would, but yeah, so that hopefully that like gets at the Hwei thing, and like ultimately I think the answer here is just like, I think Hwei's power level is fine. Just put in some games and you'll win an appropriate number of games. If you have a satisfaction problem, that's different. Anyway, let's talk about the mid laners and side laning thing. A lot of the bulk of this text here was about how does Riot Design view mid laners and side laning, right? Because Hwei, as an example, is not a particularly good side laner most of the time, right? He's good at clearing waves. And this is really interesting, I think, as a topic right now, because I don't think this really came through in any of our comms for the current season, but one of the original motivations for what would eventually become the mechanics that are Phalites and Crystal and Overgrowth was, hey, we want to make it so that mages can be more successful in a side lane, or like more champions can be successful in a side lane, right? As an example, look at a mage. What do you need to be successful in a side lane? Even assuming you're winning, right? Like assume you can actually beat the other person or like chunk them out 1v1. Not even necessarily kill them, but just like say you can force them to base, right? What do you need? Well, you can't walk up because there's no way to get enough vision. Like anyone touching you will kill you a lot of the time, especially if you spent your ult cooldown or whatever chunking out your opponent in the side lane, right? So like, okay, so let's suppose you can get pushed, because most mages can clear the wave pretty effectively, right? Let's suppose you even can win, or you can at least shove up and the other person in the 1v1 isn't threatening to instantly kill you, right? They're not a Zed or something. What do you need? Well, you need to make sure that you're not getting ganked, right? So you need better vision. That's what the Phalites are for, right? That's why the Phalites in the side lanes. I don't know if you could hear that. My stomach was just growling. Sorry if you could hear that. Anyway, sorry. That's what the Phalites were made for, was to make it so that champions who are bad at side laning that can't afford to push up and risk getting ganked have an easier time. Well, this is one of the reasons why Phalites were, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons why they were made, and the reasons why there are those really, really powerful Phalites in the side lanes that spawn after the terrain transition, was because we wanted like a Rise, for example, or a Syndra or whatever, to be able to establish vision for themselves in the side lane without needing their support to do that for them, so that they could push up. And then the tower is like, okay, well, even given that, those champions often can't afford to sit still and hit the tower for like 5 seconds to get value. So we made Crystal and Overgrowth to make it so that just one hit on the tower can actually generate value, right? And so this is one of the things where we look at this and we were saying like, hey, we think that if mages have to side lane, or really, anyone who has to side lane, right, including an AD carry, for example, whoever has to side lane, we should probably make it a little bit easier for a bad side laner to get some value out of side laning, right? And this was one of the, again, one of the things that we spent the most time thinking about and talking about, which led to, or at least partially led to, the creation of both Phalites and Crystal and Overgrowth for this season. Now, in regard specifically to designing new champions, I can't speak to what a Misery thought when he was, making Hwei on this topic, but we're well aware that it's, someone has to go into the side lane, right? At the end of the day, it actually doesn't even really matter if we were like, let's suppose we did some heavy-handed changes to say, okay, mages get to stay mid lane forever. and AD carries, you're stuck in bot lane. Okay, well, we still have a squishy ranged champion that's forced to side lane for a large portion of the game, right? And obviously there are different properties between AD carries and mages, right? Don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, I don't look at this and say like, oh, this is a problem with mages or like something we need to solve for mages. Because if we solve this, or like, because if we make mages better side laners, this means that they'll just, well, number one, they'll be better top. And it's likely, I think, to cause other problems structurally with the game where like, oh, if mages are, 90% as good at side laning as fighters, why would you that like takes away one of the core reasons why you would play fighters, right? That they're very self-sufficient and that they're very good at side laning, right? At least in terms of laners that go into like top lane and mid lane, or sorry, fighters that go in top lane and mid lane, right? I think it's one of the major reasons why you play a fighter over a mid laner, as an example, right? And so I don't necessarily think we need to solve this on like a kit level, but like more on a systemic level, right? With things like Crystal Overgrowth and Phalites, enabling champions to feel less bad about being a weaker side laner, making it so that weaker side laners can still do things that are positive in the game without necessarily needing to say like, yeah, mages, you can now easily indefinitely hold a fighter in the side lane, as an example, right? So you're still probably supposed, you're playing, Hwei side, and you get forced into side lane by your AD carry at, 17 minutes. You're probably supposed to lose to Fiora in the side lane as Hwei. The actual reality is that you can clear waves and you'll get out pressured. And that's one of the motivations for mages to take TP, is that when you're getting out pressured, you can still TP to the fight, etc. Right? There's all sorts of interlocking pieces here, right? Like summoners have a lot to do, have a lot going on here. Different, power spike thresholds have a lot to go on here. I don't necessarily want to, spiral on down. This is one of the topics where it's like I could talk about this for, multiple hours and, not draw any, not draw any hard conclusions, but just wanted to sort of give some insights into the thought process here of, we generally thought that we could bring up the floor of side laning with Phalites and Crystal and Overgrowth, but saying that, like, snapping our fingers and saying like mages are good at side laning, I actually don't think would be good for the game in terms of like, we don't actually want mages to be better at side laning than fighters, or even assassins, really. And assassins are worse than fighters, right? I think that the fact that there's like a clear tier list of side laners, which is like fighters are the best, assassins are the next best, at least at rotating, right? Like mages are better at clearing waves, so it's like there are parts of side laning that mages are better at. There are parts of side laning that assassins are better at, but I would consider assassins to be a bit better than mages for the most part, or at least at safely side laning, right? Because mages often, to safely side lane, they have to sit under a turret. Anyway, I'm probably getting too deep into this. Hopefully this was useful. I know that I just kind of spiraled out and like didn't come up with any super strong conclusions for you, but like, I guess to answer the exact question here is like, if we were making a new mage and we were thinking about like, okay, how do they side lane? We'd want to make sure that they are not like worse, like not like the worst mage ever at side laning, probably, right? Like I would say we probably wouldn't construct a new mage and say like, yeah, this is the side laning mage, unless they're a battle mage or there's some particular reason why we would want that to be true. If there's some external reason why, like, hey, we actually want this mage to be good at side laning because they're a top laner, or because they have this property that makes them really bad at team fighting, and so therefore we want them to have a win condition or whatever, right? It's like, but we don't come into making a new mage and say like, or at least I don't think we would go into making a new mage and say like, all right, we're making a normal artillery mage, and also because it's 2026, we need them to be better at side laning than all the other artillery mages, right? I don't think we would do that. I think in the context of a kit's design, we would give them side laning strength as appropriate and try to make sure that it feels good, as good as we can to side lane, but not necessarily make them, best in class because they're new or anything of that kind. All right. So this was an interesting question. It was, I think that the actual text of the question is maybe even more interesting than the specific question. It was, how to feel about the size of map compared to the MS in the game? And they were talking more specifically about the current level of jungler MS, of like, oh, I see a jungler on Raptors and then they get to me faster than I'm expecting. Couple of different things here. Specific current jungler MS. I'm personally not a huge fan of the role quest reward for junglers, giving them jungle movement speed. The jungle role quest is definitely one I'm kind of squinting at and looking at and saying like, this could definitely be better, right? Like there's for sure better structures that I think would, number one, feel better for junglers, and number two, not have like multiple stackable MS rewards, right? Like the fact that you can get blue pet and the jungle MS reward, and then you can just kind of like zoom around. I'm not a huge fan of that. And I think that we could make versions of the jungle quest and like that would just be better. Like that would be more fun, like more fun and satisfying for junglers. While also not causing bizarre MS stacking like flying around the map stuff. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The more interesting question to me is about like the size of the map compared to the MS, because how much MS someone is likely to have on average. It's like, this is just learnable, right? Like ultimately at the end of the day, if your complaint is I keep getting surprised by junglers at Raptors, it's like, okay, well, you can learn that, right? Like that one's like, okay, yeah, it's on the first patch or like the first couple patches of a new season, sure, things are going to surprise you, but this one is pretty clearly learnable, right? You can understand, like you can figure out, hey, this jungler is going to take 3 seconds now to cross this instead of 4.5 or whatever the difference is. So that stuff's learnable, and I think it's not and it's like, again, like I said, I think the junglers are probably a bit too fast, or like at least especially with blue pet, overall a little bit too speedy, and we could give them that power somewhere else that would be more satisfying for them probably. Anyway, I keep getting distracted by other things. Anyway, point I'm getting at, I think another question that is interesting is the size of the map compared to the MS in the game, because there's a little bit more MS overall in the game comparatively to say like 10 years ago. And the size of the map factors into this. Another factor that people don't really consider that much, or like two factors, are also player vision range and the default size of the screen, right? Like with a view of the player. These are things that are really interesting that I think most players don't really ever think about, like vision range, like exactly how long the champion vision range is, or like the size of the screen, like the default view. But it's funny, it's something I had to think about a lot when I first moved and went on and worked on Wild Rift, because Wild Rift's map's actually about 33% smaller. And the screen size is also smaller, but not by 33%. I think it's like 25% smaller, something like that. And those differences actually caused differences in the way that we had to treat a lot of like champion spells and like how we treated movement speed in Wild Rift, which is really interesting. I think this is something that we talk about internally every so often, right? As an example, when we were doing the season 14 map changes, we actually did experiment with a larger map, as just like a thought, not a thought experiment, but like as an experiment of like, what does it look like if it takes longer to go from top to mid, for example, or it takes longer to get from base to top, or base to your lane or whatever, right? And I think our conclusions were kind of interesting in that, like, it's not necessarily good or bad. It's only good or bad in the context of other things that you do with that, right? Like, would it be good or bad to make it so that going to top lane has a higher time cost compared to the other roles, right? Like one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about for season 14 in particular was like, what if top lane was further away? And the end conclusion was like, actually, it probably makes more sense for the top laner to just give them a better access to vision and make it so that it's harder to gank top lane by closing off the red side gap and preventing people from getting easily behind them that way, and giving them access to a more powerful brush and a more open entrance that would mean that it's easier to establish vision control, so it's harder to gank them. And that got us a lot of the effects that we were looking for at the time, without also adding the top laner, if you want to like interact with mid lane, it also takes you longer, right? Because it takes us, because the map is the same size as before. I think in relation specifically to the amount of movement speed in the game, there is a little bit more MS in the game overall today compared to, again, 10 years ago, like what I was saying. But I don't think we consider that to be a significant problem. It is interesting, though, that this is something that I think manifests a little bit in terms of how certain champions interact with other champions. Like I think Cho'Gath is a really good example of this. Of like, Cho'Gath loves movement speed, and despite the fact that I think his kit doesn't want other people to have movement speed because his Q is such a fair spell. He himself loves having movement speed, which is interesting. There's a lot of symmetry there, right? Like, typically speaking, not universally true, but a lot of the champions, for example, that really, really, really like having MS actually really don't want other people to have MS, which is funny. Because a lot of what they're looking for is MS differential. And so they're being a little bit overall more MS in the game. Ends up being kind of both a blessing and a curse for these champions. Again, I think Cho'Gath is a really good example here. Anyway, I'm kind of spiraling off. Let's focus up on the actual question here of around size of map compared to MS. I think it's fine. Are there slightly better configurations, right? Interesting thought experiment here is would the game be better or worse if we subtracted 5 MS from every champion? And my answer to that is I'm not actually sure, right? Because it'll feel worse because your character will move slightly slower. So it's there's a small feels loss for literally everyone in the game. It means vision is more powerful because people can't cross through vision as quickly, so they can't surprise you as much, right? It means that roaming is slightly worse, so everyone's slower. I mean, you're more likely to actually secure a kill when you roam, but it takes you longer to get there. So roaming's probably overall slightly worse, right? There's a lot of implications on this, right? And you could take more and more extreme versions of this, right? What about 25 MS less on everyone, right? Well, that'll feel pretty terrible, right? That one seems like kind of a non-starter because it feels so bad. But it's an interesting topic. I think to actually answer the question, I think we feel fine with the size of the map relative to current amounts of normal MS. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an ideal state. This is something where I think that to have a really strong conclusion here, you would need to do a lot of understanding of vision range and screen size and are those appropriate? Because the actual answer here might be actually maybe champions are supposed to have 25 more vision range in the modern day because people are coming at them slightly faster, or maybe you're supposed to have 50 more vision range, or maybe your screen size is supposed to be slightly larger, or towers are supposed to have more vision, or wards are supposed to have 50 more vision range, or whatever, right? There's a lot of different conflating factors here that ultimately add up to we want champions to be a certain size, not just for gameplay reasons, but for thematic reasons. You can see your champion and see that they're doing cool stuff and see their animations and all of that. And so a lot of the rest of this gets derived from, are we happy with how players see their champion and interact with their own champion visuals, and interact with spell effects? Okay, I would say that we are right now. Okay, so everything else should derive from those things. So we're probably not changing the screen size, right, as an example, or how zoomed in or out the screen is, because of that. Okay, given that, what about vision range? Are we happy with vision range? Are we happy with how frequently you get surprised by someone at your vision range because of how fast they are, right? Do you have an appropriate amount of time to respond to someone who shows up at exactly your vision range? What about half your vision range because they were in a brush or around a corner or whatever, right? Do we think that that's appropriate? I think that currently it seems fine to me. I'm not, I don't think that there's I haven't seen anything that suggests that this is super off, but it is an interesting topic. It's something it's definitely worth thinking about. All right. So this is another topic, talking about a new AD HP AH Bruiser item that gives attack speed on CC as a passive. So two separate things here, talking about AS. The rest of their post talked a lot about AS on Bruiser items. So this specific item, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about because I think that largely my answer is that I don't think this would be a good item. Fighter CCs tend to be unreliable, right? The example they were using in their post was Briar, which is she's one of the few fighters that has a 100% reliability CC. It's not even literally 100% because you can get your dash canceled by a knock-up or something like that. But it's close to 100% reliability, right? Most combats it will land, right? But most fighters don't have 100% reliability on their CC. And one of the things we pretty consistently find in item design is that if your item doesn't work consistently, it feels really bad, right? This is why, for example, Steraks is a lifeline item instead of the old version that required you to be dealt a certain amount of damage in a certain amount of time in order to trigger the passive. I think from a structural perspective, the older version of Steraks makes more sense. It says oh, this is really only going to be good in a team fight or if you're being bursted. And it's not good in side lane because in the side lane where you're fighting against often one person, it's not as good because it just won't trigger a lot of the time, right? But that version of the item feels incredibly bad, right? Like dying and seeing your Stair Axis off cooldown and being like, what the hell? I bought this item to let me survive, and it didn't do that. This sucks, right? And because a lot of fighter CCs are unreliable, we haven't made a fighter CC trigger item for that reason, because we don't we don't want to offer like outputs that people will feel like they have to opt into power wise, because they're the stat line, like assuming that this item was actually like factually good on many champions, which I'm also suspicious of that, but assuming it was good on someone besides Briar, who has a like not 100% reliability CC, like Jarvan is a really good example. It's like you don't always land your EQ on Jarvan, and you just don't, right? It's just not going to happen. This would likely feel pretty bad, right? Like the items that have these highly variable, like low reliability outputs that feel like they should work. And I think this would fall into that category. So I'm not going to really talk about that specific item. But AS on fighter items, though, I think is a pretty interesting topic, because there are fighters that do like AS. One of the interesting things I'd like to point out here is that there are options, right? People talk about this like there's literally no options, right? But it's like, well, there's Hexplate, there's Trinity Force, there's Stridebreaker. There are 3 items, right? And in fairness, 2 of those items are pretty narrow, right? Stridebreaker and Hexplate, although Stridebreaker is not that narrow, right? You can buy it on a lot of champs. Anyway, but there are more options, I think, than people recognize. Even like Wit's End is a real fighter option for some champions, like Gnar, for example. And Bork is an option for some, right? But, mainline fighter items, right? Like items that have health on them, and AD, there are 3 options for that. Anyway, I keep getting distracted by specifics. ASN fighter items, I think, is an interesting topic, because there are a number of fighters that when you look at their kits, you might say like, oh, AS should be good on this champion. And then when you actually sit down and do the math, you're like, actually, AS is really not that good. Briar is a really good example. Briar W gives 95% attack speed at max rank. Attack speed is a linearly scaling stat. The more AS you have, the more relative value other stats have, right? This is like, imagine that we had a champion, like an AD carry, for example, who has an ultimate that gives them 100, like not even ultimate, has a basic ability that gives them 100 AD with very high uptime at max rank. Let me tell you something, about this champion that's probably not going to be surprising. That champion is going to mostly buy attack speed, right? Because the most effective multiplier for that stat, for the AD that they already have on their kit, is attack speed, and they're probably going to buy crit, right? Obviously, depending on the context of the rest of their kit and all of that, right? But if possible, you're going to buy the things that scale your kit most effectively, right? And so AS actually isn't that good on Briar. It feels good, don't get me wrong, right? I've played a lot of Briar in my time. Building Blade the Rune King feels awesome. The reason why Bork is good is because Bork offers you a payout that multiplies with the attack speed that you already have on your W, right? It has an on hit on it. 1 second. Sorry about that. But what I'm getting at here is that when we want a fighter to attack quickly, we often just give them a lot of AS. And Trinity Force is a really interesting example here, where you can compare to Divine Sunderer when that was in the game, and you can see there's some interesting tuning differences between the items, where we don't really charge you the full amount for the attack speed on Trinity Force. We know that there are a lot of champions, like, say, Wukong, who doesn't really value the attack speed on Trinity Force, but we don't charge you the full amount for it, really, right? Like, this is in the same way that we don't really charge you the full amount for mana on the like the Lost Chapter items, right? The price of a stat is really whatever we say that it is. It doesn't necessarily, we don't have to actually charge what we think something should cost in the shop, right? We charge whatever we want, and we charge whatever we think makes the game the best. And because of this, on Trinity Force, we kind of give you a lot of attack speed at not really much cost, because most of the Trinity Force users actually aren't getting full value from that AS, right? And we generally think that this is a good outcome, because it means that, number one, attack speed is the most feelable stat in the game. It feels good to have. And so if we can find a way to give you that stat in a way that feels good for you, because you don't have to pay a ton of gold for it, that's great, right? That just means that we've just made the champions that buy that item feel better. And we can tune the champions that actually do want that attack speed around the item, right? Because we're totally okay with hard binding champions to Trinity Force as long as it feels good for them, which it does, right? Anyway, I've moved away from the point a little bit. Hopefully that was illustrative. But anyway, the point I'm actually getting at here is that I think number one, people do overvalue how useful attack speed is actually on most fighters. Number two, we try to get this to champions in some places, like Trinity Force being a good one. And we do want people to feel good about their builds. And so I do think that it would be good for us to have more attack speed options. However, if we were to actually build like a second item that is more attack speed favored, right? I think a lot of the likely results of that are like Hexplate, where they have to do something really crazy, and even then, they're still really, really, really narrow, and they're hard binding for certain champions, right? Like Nocturne, for example. We've run into a lot of difficulties here, right? Like for the Season 14 item update, for example, Hexplate was the result of a long series of experimentations on what attack speed fighter itemization could look like. And I think it ended up in a space where it's like, I don't think it's super great. I think it's one of the like weaker items in the shop from a design perspective. And while it is, I think at least with the buffs that it got last year, at least it's cool for a few champions, and it's like interesting and like cool to think about, right? Like, some people, I met a guy who was like, oh, I love playing Hexplate set. I dunk someone, in, and then I beat them up with my fists. It's like, okay, cool. You know what? More power to you. Have a great time playing Hexplate set. Awesome. And I was like he literally was saying like he played like 100 games in a row of Hexplate first set. Okay, whatever you want, man. Anyway, getting distracted again. Let me reiterate my points. Number one, I think AS is actually less good on fighters because if we want them to attack quickly, we just give them a lot of AS. Or we give them like auto attack resets and things like that, right? Look at Briar, look at Jax, right? We just give them massive AS steroids, right? And this doesn't mean that that necessarily means that you can't build attack speed, right? Look at Aurelia, for example, where she has a on-hit applicator that she can use multiple times per fight, and she has a large AS steroid, which rewards her for building on hits. And so she builds a largely on hit favored build, right? So there are kit structures that do reward having some attack speed in your build, but it's not largely because you need the actual stat attack speed. It's actually interesting. I think Darius is like one of the better users of attack speed in the fighter system because he has a massive AD steroid in his passive, right? What I was talking about earlier around like multiplying the stats effectively. If you have a bunch of like a way to get a bunch of AD, especially a way that attack speed makes you more likely to get it. Attack speed is one of the more effective ways to multiply that AD, right? Because it just means your auto attacks do way more DPS. Anyway, all of this having been said, right? I've said a lot of negative things about attack speed on fighters, where it's like, not as many needed as you might think, and they're kind of buying it incidentally because it's on Trinity Force or whatever, or the champions that do buy it on like Bork, they're often buying that for the on hit and not because the attack speed is good. In fact, I would actually argue on Briar, the attack speed is the worst part of Bork. Maybe the lifesteal is worse. I don't know. It's probably close. But the AD and the on hit are the most valuable parts of that item for her. But all of this having been said, I still do think there is room for attack speed fighter items. Kind of what I was saying earlier is like attack speed feels really good. And I think that a conditional passive that gives you AS is actually a compelling idea for an item. I think specifically on Immobilize is not really compelling to me because a lot of our fighter Immobilizes are just not super high reliability, and so that would feel really, really, really bad for a lot of the potential users, right? Like Aurelia, for example, right? It's like her CC is not reliable, right? Like it's not going to hit every combat. But all of this having been said, it is a difficult space. Like I said, this was something that was explored a lot for the Season 14 item changes, and we ended up with an item that I think ended up not being that great for the space. But it is a space that I would expect at some point someone will revisit. Maybe it'll be me. Maybe it'll be someone else. I would not be surprised because attack speed is just one of the stats that feels awkward to access as a fighter, right? If you did actually want it, which again, I think the audience for that isn't big, but it is there. If you did actually factually want attack speed as a fighter, it's hard to get unless you happen to be a champion that really likes Stridebreaker or Trinity Force. And that doesn't cover every fighter. It covers a lot of them when you combine both of them, but it's not everyone, right? And so ultimately my answer to this is like, I think it would be good to have an item for fighters that would give you some AS. But it's a hard space. It's something we've tried before, even relatively recently. And it is a difficult space to make work. All right. Is there any chance that cleansing effects for Varus' ultimate wouldn't cleanse the passive stacks it applies? I like to play AP Varus, but it feels like half my kit is nullified. The enemy takes cleansers QSS. So this one is like, I'm not saying we can or can't do this. I mean, we could. Obviously, we could do it. My biggest immediate like alarm bell that goes off when I read this question is like, okay, how is the opponent supposed to know that they're getting blight stacks applied to them still after they remove the ult? Because normally it's you get ulted and you gain the blight stacks over time while the ult is on you. If the ult is not on you, how are we communicating that you're still gaining blight stacks, right? Over the duration. I think that's very awkward where I think given the current state where he does not have a visual, I would not like, to me that kind of seems like a non-starter. Now imagine we did have a visual, right? Like that actually the visuals of you gaining, the blight stacks were separate from the ultimate. Would I think this would be good? I'm not confident that it's good or bad. I think to me the visual stuff is a non-starter where like I imagine, you QSS or you cleanse Varus ult and then you just randomly have 3 blight stacks, 2 seconds later and you're like, what, like, where did these come from? That doesn't seem reasonable to me. But assume we had a new visual or like we were, we really wanted to make this work. And so we wanted to add a new visual. Is the gameplay better or worse? I don't know. It's interesting because most of our like secondary effects on CC do go away when you cleanse or remove the CC. Not literally all of them though. And so this is on a case-by-case basis. This one is interesting where I think about this and I think like, okay, so let's not even consider the expectations on either side here. Is the gameplay of Varus hitting his ult, having his ult cleansed, and then still getting the blight stacks good or bad? Okay, so the blight stacks being applied means that you get to do a bunch of extra damage, right? Not even consider like AP Varus specifically, just like generic Varus in a void. I'm not thinking about his build, right? Okay, so the ultimate applies a bunch of blight stacks, meaning that you don't have to attack as much. And you can still get the huge payout on the blight stacks, right? Blight stacks do a fair amount of damage base, even if you're not AP, right? Do I want the blight stacks generated by R if R lands to be higher reliability, even if the opponent is accessing systemic counterplay to the R? I don't know. I think the question becomes then, do we want Varus to be more of a caster? Do we want to be encouraged to attack? Do we think that it's right even for the R to apply blight stacks, right? To me, I think that personally, and you can feel free to disagree. I think that's fine. I think that the blight stacks are more interesting if their power is more indexed into you had to attack your opponent. I think that the powerful things that like AP Varus does in particular are much more acceptable if they come from an origin point of he had to attack you multiple times. When we load, oh, you got hit by Varus ultimate, guess what? You got one shot from 90% HP as a tank is like, obviously, AP Varus has been nerfed a number of times for this reason, right? But I'm kind of dubious of the gameplay around the blight stacks carrying a lot of power. And to me, Varus is more interesting if we ask him to attack more and cast less, even as an AP guy, right? Like where your casts are very powerful, but you need to set them up by attacking the opponent. That's more interesting to me personally. Partially because that means the payout for popping blight gets to be a lot larger. And so to me, that kind of suggests that we shouldn't change this. Even if we had visuals, like magically snap our fingers, we have visuals to communicate this. I think that kind of leads me down the road of like, if I had the ability to make a visual for this, which I don't, would I change it? I think the answer is no. And in fact, I question whether the blight stacks on Varus Ultimate are actually good for the kit or not. This is something where maybe I'd consider it differently if I deeply considered Varus's kit and I looked at like all the different versions over the years. But I think that currently, even for non-AP Varus, I think there's too much power loaded into hitting your ultimate on Varus currently. Like I wish that we could put power elsewhere. Obviously, it's a difficult space, right? He has a very pro-skewed kit. Even just the fact that he has build flexibility, but mostly lethality Varus is the pro-skewed part. But there's difficulties here, and maybe I'd feel differently if I reviewed the entire history of Varus and looked at things. But I feel like his ultimate is currently just carrying too much weight of the kit, and it's like, imagine as an AP Varus player if I offered you a trade of like, okay, ult no longer stacks blight, but your blight gets to do like 25% more damage, right? Is that a trade you would take? Because I think that's actually like the ratio could probably be significantly higher if ult didn't stack blight, right? Because you'd have to attack people multiple times to actually get that off, right? So I think it's an interesting thought experiment of like the space of, is the ult applying blight stacks right? Do we want to put more or less power budget into that? Should it, like, what if it applied one stack on hit, or whatever, right? Like, not saying I'm going to make any changes, right? I want to be clear here. It's like, I'm not. This is just like me thinking out loud here, not me saying I'm going to go change Varus. But the more I think about this mechanic, the less confident I am that actually, at least in my sort of ideal shape of Varus's kit, that the ult applying blight should have more power budget into it. In fact, I would rather personally it have less. All right, now that the Mell changes are out, do you have any thoughts about them? So this is talking about the Mell changes that were posted up by Misery, I think, on the League subreddit. I think they're on the PB right now, although I'm not 100% sure about that. Something I do want to note before I get into these is that I don't have a bunch of experiential gameplay feedback of playing against the Mell changes. I was in a couple of the early playtests where we were testing some lists that were very, very, very different from what we shipped. But I haven't really played against the actual, like played against, with, or as the Mell changes. What I'll say about my current take on the list, which is largely derived from talking with the Misery and looking at the list, is I think they're probably a step in the right direction. I think that her not like, and one of the changes is actually something I suggested very early on in the process, which was that Mell Reflect reduces physical damage before it converts it to magic, because magic damage is so much better than physical. This is something that I was talking with him about early on in the process, because I was, it was something where it's like I was observing a lot of games, like I was even playing some AD carry where it's like, oh, you auto attack, it gets reflected late game, it actually does completely ridiculous damage. Not just because Mell has a lot of AP and her reflect percentage is really high, but because she's converting raw physical damage into magic damage, which then does significantly higher amounts of damage because people have way less MR than they have armor. That's just how the stats work. Anyway, overall, I think it's a good step in the right direction. I think there's a bunch of smaller things that are improvements. I am not confident that this will like magically solve all of Mell's problems and suddenly she will live happily ever after. I suspect there will probably be a time where we'll need to do even more changes on her, and maybe they'll need to be more extreme. But I'd be happy if I was wrong in this case, right? Like I think this, like, basically the way that I look at the current Mell list is, I think it's a good step in the right direction. I am not confident that it is sufficient to solve all of the problems. I do think her not being invulnerable is a big step up. I think that's really nice, both for frustration and for counterplay purposes, right? Like the fact that she can't just like immune your Darius R or whatever, right? I think makes a lot more sense to me. So I think it's good. Will it be enough? Only time can tell. So that's my thoughts. So why is there no good rush for melee crit users? This one's interesting because I think it's a combination of a few things. One is that I think it's how do I put this? Expectations being set in a way that we can't really meet in the modern day by the Mythic system, which just was a system that carried, had like ridiculous amounts of power loaded into singular items. Sorry. It's very hard for us to make items that offer everything that a melee crit user could want, because they want a lot of things. They want AD, they want AS, they want defenses, they probably even want lifesteal, right? This is literally what the old shield bow used to offer, and at least for an offensive item, the old Kraken used to offer all the stats and a powerful effect and so on and so forth, right? Okay, that's all fair, right? I think it's difficult for us to even offer that combination of effects on any one item, right? Not talking about like disregard melee crit users, just like look at the items that we have to offer. We can't offer you super complete items that give you everything that you want if you are a multiplicative scaler, which is what crit is, right? Fundamentally, crit as a stat is a scalar, right? It says I am taking a ratio and I am multiplying it in the modern day by 2, right? Every time this occurs, right? And because crit is the most multiplicative build path in the game, it's very hard for us to give you a complete first item that does all the things that you want to do when your build is also going to be fundamentally one of the best scaling builds in the game. Now, I understand that these crit champions that are melee operate by slightly different rules than the ranged crit champions, right? They're not quite, stacking as many multipliers a lot of the time, right? They're often not even going to go 100% crit on, like the crit Viego builds, for example, or like Belveth, right? Now, the Yasuo and Yone, they are going to get 100% crit at some point during the game, right? But they get double crit, and they have different interactions with the item system. I'm not going to talk too much about them, because I think they're kind of special cases, right? They interact in a unique way with the item system. But I am interested in talking about like Belveth and Viego, right, as like crit melees, and even Master Yi to a lesser degree, though obviously his crit build's kind of degraded. What about them, right? I think the difficulty with this is that crit is just such a powerful scaling stat that unless we want to commit to them having a unique hook into the system, any item that we make for them that makes sense for them to bridge into full crit builds, like I'm talking about like a literally 100% crit builds, is an item that would be supremely messed up on a ranged champion. Now, we could range melee split an item. Like we could say, hey, here is a version of shield bow that offers all of the things that you want as a melee, and we range melee split it such that it's worthless on ranged champions. You'll never buy this, right? Or you'll buy this 10% of the time on Samira or whatever, right? It's a difficult space though, because the question then becomes: is that actually better for them? Like that we make an entire item just for these champions, just to bridge them into the crit system, when they're not going to, likely not going to commit fully to it unless we give them a special, even more special treatment in the crit system. And I want to be clear. I'm asking the question, right? Like, is that better or is that worse? I don't have a definitive answer. My gut instinct is that that is worse, and that we would rather have those champions build like a Kraken Slayer and then like let them get crit second item or whatever if they want to do that as like a damage option, because fundamentally crit is a multiplier, right? Crit fundamentally makes more sense as a later game stat than a first item stat, right? Obviously, we've structured the game in such a way that it works first item, for a number of different reasons. But if I told, but in the same way that armor penetration is actually always good, right? Like percent armor penetration, not flat armor penetration. Or like death cap is always good. But it's better later in your build, right? It gives you percent more AP. Crit gives you percent more auto attack damage, right? And so I think we kind of set expectations poorly with the mythic system, where it's like, oh, you're going to be able to get crit whenever you want. It's like, well, crit is basically the death cap for auto attacks, right? That is fundamentally what it is. And so to me, melee crit champions getting crit in their first slot makes less sense to me than them getting crit in their later slots. Now, if what you're saying is like, well, they need defenses in their later slots, yeah, I think that's fair. And maybe the answer is actually that we need another item like Shield Bow that's actually a good defensive crit item for melees that lets them multiply their auto attack DPS, that also, or, in the case of like Viego, it's also has Q spell damage, but lets them multiply, but also lets them get defenses at the same time. And so then they get to build their early game items, and then they start building their defensive items and their multipliers at the same time. Or maybe we give them a second item that works really well. But I'm less the more I've looked at this system structurally, the less convinced I am that it's necessary or even correct to give crit on the first item specifically. Now, we could give an item that scales with crit, for example, and says hey, here's a really good first item for these champions that scales with crit in some way, such that you feel really good about it when you build crit in your later slots. That's I think a promising direction that I like. That's if I were working on this right now, it's something that I would explore for sure. Where it's well, this item itself doesn't have crit, but it does say if you get crit in the rest of your build, you're very happy with that. But the more that I've examined this system structure, or the structure of this, the less confident I am that the actual solution is literally, here is a really powerful first item that has crit on it, because that is a multiplier for your auto attack damage, right? Do you want to build Deathcap first as a mage, right? Like, that's kind of what you're asking for here, right? And if your thought process then is like, well, that's what AD carries do. It's like, well, yeah, sure, they do, absolutely, right? But all of their items are Deathcap, right? So they have to build it Deathcap in their first slot, right? It's kind of an interesting perspective. Like, I think it's a really compelling comparison, and I'd be happy to talk about this more if people want to. But it's just like, I think, consider this question in the context that crit is essentially the death cap of auto attacking. Do you think that it's correct for you to have crit on your first item, or would you rather have an item that is less about scaling, or less about purely scaling your auto attack damage and more about giving you the things that you need right now and leveraging you into the build that you into the stats that you want to have in the rest of your build? So something to think about. All right. So this was a lot of text that I kind of summarized down to. They were talking about like, smurfing and like, hey, here, I understand some of the problems of like having different MMRs and different roles, but I'm a Briar mid one trick, and I was trying to play Neela, and I really really struggled, and it was very hard because I'm a higher skill on Briar mid, et cetera, et cetera. This one I'll tell you straight up, we don't have a great answer for, right? Like, we tried Roll Q back in season 9, season 10, I don't remember what season that was, as an experiment in NA and I think one other region, maybe it was like LAN, LAS, I don't recall. But we tried it in a couple of regions, and we saw some pretty serious problems with it. This does not mean we can't solve those problems, right? In my opinion, I actually had an amazing time playing the game when Roll Q was around, as an example. I loved it, right? I played a ton of AD carry. I wasn't very good at AD carry at the time. And I loved having a separate MMR or like a separate rank for my AD carry. There are problems with these systems. Does that mean that we can't solve those problems? No, right? I will tell you straight up, I am not an expert on this subject, right? This is something that is handled by other types of designers out there. My understanding of the basics here is that this is something that is a known problem, but all of the solutions have like significant other trade-offs that we're not necessarily willing to opt into, at least at the current time. It is something that is definitely known. We've tried, again, in the past, we've tried a number of different solutions here. The Roll Q experiment was one of them, which had its own problems. But all of this having been said, it is something I would love for us to take another crack at. And I would not be surprised if the team that works on this type of stuff would love to take another crack at it too. I don't have a great solution for you, right? I don't have a great saying of like, oh, you should do this, right? It's like, ultimately, yeah. At the end of the day, it's like, if your skill is really, really, really sharply concentrated in like a specific role or specific champion, you want to play something else. At the end of the day, the best solution might actually be that you level a Smurf and play on that Smurf, and only play that thing on your Smurf. And as long as that's what you're doing, right? You play the game on on your own. You have a second account, and that's how you're doing it. That is not grounds for getting executed by Drew Levin on Twitter, right? The things that get you there are like boosting people or doing hitchhiking, etc. Right? Like, and I'm not going to get super in depth on that, but I agree it's not ideal. The current situation is not ideal, but we haven't found a solution that is super effective right now. So that's where we're at. All right, question about marksmen / supports in the jungle. This one's interesting. So they were talking about like, hey, we've seen lots of champions being pushed to to be more viable in the jungle. You talk about like Fizz or Ornn or Malphite or Sylas. What about marksmen? What about enchanters? They said supports, but actually they meant enchanters. Or at least that's what it seemed like from the text. So a couple of things here. Number one is that the goal of a lot of those changes was, hey, this is a low cost way for us to it's pretty easy, like in terms of time investment, for us to put some jungle mods on some spells and get a new champion into the jungle. And some percentage of the time, they actually end up being good, right? As an example from last year, we had that batch that was like Ornn, Fizz, Malphite. And it's like, well, Ornn and Fizz ended up not actually being good junglers with like reasonable jungle clear speeds. But Malphite did, right? And Malphite jungle is still good. It's still playable on live today. the goal was was not to succeed on all of these. Number one thing I will note, people like, oh, you buff Vayne jungle, but it's still bad. It's like, well, the goal wasn't all of these all these champions will for sure be viable in the jungle. It was, hey, we're gonna try this out, and if it works, it works, and if it didn't, we only spent like an hour on this, so it was a low cost thing for us to try, and it's high, like it's basically high upside for investment, but it's not, the success rate is not intended to be 100%, right? Anyway, success rate stuff aside, let's talk about some of those failures, right? As an example, let's talk about Ornn. Ornn jungle, like, when I looked at it after the patch, I don't know what it is right now, but it was like 43% win rate, right? This is pretty clearly bad, at least for solo queue purposes, right? I'm not talking about coordinated play. Things are different there. But for the purposes of solo queue, it's pretty clear Ornn jungle is not very good, right? And the question then becomes, okay, how good is the clear, right? Let's talk about Zed as another example. Zed's clear speed, in order to be a like 48% win rate jungle, was literally the best in the game, by a lot, right? Like Zed was clearing at completely insane rates. And we've nerfed him a couple times. I think, are we nerfing him next patch, or did we already nerf him? I don't know what's going on there. But we generally found that there are limits to how viable, like how functional we can make a jungler by increasing their clear speed, right? Because again, look at Zed as an example of, hey, Zed's clear is literally the fastest in the game, and he's still not even 50% in the jungle. Obviously, there's other things going on here, right? It's Zed, he's hard, and so on and so forth, right? But what we found is that these really incredibly fast clearing junglers that often are like balanced or even weak slightly, have properties that make them not, like, have kit properties that make them not particularly good at a lot of the other things that junglers do. And so there are limits to how much we can increase clear speed to make champions functional in the jungle. And that's where we're going to loop around to the actual question here, which is marksman and supports in the jungle. Specifically on marksman, there have actually been many patches over the past couple of years where Kai'Sa jungle had a like pretty respectable clear speed. However, she's not a good jungler, right? Because marksmen in general don't do the things that are like that make you a good jungler, right? You're not good at fighting over the crap. You're not good at ganking lanes. You aren't good at like blasting epic monsters, right? On your own, right? Like you're not super self-sufficient. And what we found with like Vayne, for example, with her changes was, we can give her, we can give these champions reasonable clear speeds, but the amount of clear speed they would need to have like a real shot at competing in the jungle is completely insane, right? They would need to be faster than Zed in order to be competitive. And I think we've come around to the conclusion, after seeing Zed for a while, actually, we don't even want people to be as fast as Zed. We want jungle clear speeds to be slower than that. Across the board, right? Including Zed, right? Which I think is why either we nerfed him last patch, or I think we're nerfing him next patch. We'll see about that. I'm not entirely sure. Or maybe 2 patches ago we nerfed him. I don't know. At some point we decided that Zed needed to have a slower clear speed. I don't know if that's already in the game or not. I have no idea. I haven't seen a Zed jungle in ages. Anyway, point I'm actually getting at is that AD carries, for the most part, lack the kits necessary to be effective junglers in the current game. We just ask junglers to do a lot of things that require you to be really self-sufficient, or be really good at ganking lanes. And AD carries don't do either. And so that becomes really, really difficult for us to make it so it's like, we don't actually think we can make Jinx a good jungler, right? I think the champions that are probably closest amongst the marksmen are the utility AD carries, right? This is Ashe, Varus, and Jhin, because they actually have spells that can be used to gank someone. It's like, you can imagine an Ashe rolling up on you at level 4 and hitting you with the W, slowing you down and training you down, and being like, okay, well that's like a you can gank someone with that, and you can use the W to disengage with the enemy jungler, so you don't have to die to them every time you see them on your screen. Similar like with Varus or whatever, right? So there are probably some AD carries we could try, and then the question is, do we want those champions in the jungle? Do we actually think that's good for the game? Because one of the things that's dangerous is if you have super multiplicatively scaling champions in the jungle, like champions that just can sit in the jungle and farm up and become monsters that kill everyone late game. That's really scary from a counterplay perspective because like Kale, for example, or Kassadin, you can shut them out of the game in lane, right? They have to expose themselves to risk in order to get experience and gold. The jungle isn't really like that, right? The counterplay to someone farming in the jungle is relatively minimal. It does exist, but it's much, much, much more difficult to access and much more dependent upon other external factors in the game, right? Like as an example, it's like, okay, well, the Kale is farming, Kale is pushing up. That is largely isolated. Like the ability to punish the Kale is largely isolated to that lane. Whereas the ability to punish the jungle is largely about like whether your lanes have push and whether you can establish vision control in jungles and on jungle entrances and so on and so forth. And so just invade them is not really clear counterplay if the Ashe jungle is going to come out of the jungle at 25 minutes with 3 items and just win, right? This is one of the risks, like one of the dangers with like Gwen jungle as well, for example, is that she doesn't have sufficient ability for people to impede her, or there's not sufficient counterplay to her actually like scaling up and farming in order for her to have like appropriate levels of counterplay for the type of scaling power that she has, which is one of the reasons why we, I think, just nerfed Gwen jungle in the 0.2 patch, I believe. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we did that. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that Gwen jungle can't exist. It just means that we have to be very careful about how she manifests her power. Anyway, so that's the main concern with marksmen in the jungle. I think enchanters are a little different in the sense that they don't really scale super hard, and some of them are actually pretty good at ganking. This is where I think some champions like Lulu and Karma, like some of the more aggressive mage-like enchanters, have some of the properties that I think make sense as junglers. Now, there's some risks with this, right? Like, if you can play an enchanter in the jungler, does that mean that there's ever like a real reason to play an enchanter bot? Because the enchanter in the jungle can get items so quickly, right? This is like something that Ivern does that's really, really, really powerful. And his whole kit is tuned around it, right? The fact that he gets items faster because he's in the jungle compared to other enchanters, and his items are super, super, super cheap and really efficient, right? Because most enchanters are supports. So does that mean we have to reconsider the enchanter item system or we have to retune these kits if they're junglers? I'm not sure, right? But I think that it's much more likely that it's much more plausible to me that we could actually get champions like a Lulu or a Karma or I don't know, who would be another good one? What other enchanters do we have? Maybe Seraphine. Although her spell cadence is really slow, so that one's kind of tough. But Lulu and Karma are the two that stand out to me as like, yeah, I think they have a lot of the properties that would make up like, useful, strong junglers. And they've also had jungle viability in the past, which makes it more clear that like there's something to that. Though obviously the jungle today is very different from when those champions were functional junglers. But yeah, I think supports, and specifically enchanters, you're more likely to see in the jungle than marksmen. We took a crack at Vayne. It was very far from successful. I think that the casters are more likely to be functional, but I think they're also more likely to be problematic in some ways. I think Jhin is maybe the most likely one where it's like, I think that I could believe that Jhin jungle could be compelling if we structured it correctly, because it doesn't scale quite the same way that other AD carries do, right? He's basically a mage. And so that could be interesting, right? But that's hopefully just like that whole sequence of thoughts gives you some useful stuff to think about in terms of marksman enchanters in the jungle. All right. Could and why doesn't Varus Q not scale faster with attack speed? So it's an interesting topic. I've talked a little bit about this exact topic on Varus in one of my previous Q&As. I think it was the first one, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So cast time scaling with attack speed is interesting. If you look at AD carries, there's a couple of different cast time scaling down. I'll use Sivir Q as an example, which is a spell that deals damage and only damage. Technically, I guess it triggers your passive, but it's just a damage spell, right? And it scales down with attack speed. Lucian Q, cast time scales down with level. And it only does damage and triggers Lucian passive. I guess in that way, it's kind of similar to Sivir Q. Who knew? They were really the same spell all along. Anyway, so what about Varus Q, Varus E? Could they and why don't they? Okay, so a couple things here. Let's talk about Varus E first. Varus E slows people. Varus is an AD carry. The expectation is that at range, if he doesn't get engaged upon, in most cases, he's going to be winning combat with people on average. And it's important for him to have counterplay to spacing you, right? Like he needs to stand still to attack you. He needs to stand still to cast his spells. one of the reasons why I think it's correct for Varus not to scale with attack speed is that we don't actually want him to be better at slowing people over the course of game time, right? Because as he builds attack speed, he's already standing still less and hitting you more, right? And so him being able to slow you with his E, with minimal gameplay, right? E is a pretty easy spell to land on Varus. It's not really in your opponent's hands to dodge that unless they have like a dash or a flash or they're moving at like 800 ms, right? It's a very powerful non-committal slow that will give Varus a movement advantage on whoever is getting hit by it. So it's probably important that it has a real cast time. And in general, I think having real cast times is extremely important. This is why whenever someone brings up like, oh, could you remove the cast time or like whatever on these spells, like I generally respond to that pretty negatively. I think cast times are extremely important and we should be very, 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 very careful about minimizing or removing them. Because it's really important for the structure of League of Legends that people have counterplay or people have the ability to, like, number one, understand what's going on by seeing, hey, that person is casting that spell. And number two, actually be able to like access counterplay of, hey, I can throw something at them while they're casting their spell. And that gives me a window of opportunity to actually respond to their action, right? It means that not all, like, taking an action has a cost. And so that, that gives the defender, some level of advantage, right? It's important. Or like the person being acted upon has a window of opportunity to respond, right? That's important. Anyway, I think that Varus already giving him a movement advantage because it's a slow is the same reason why I think that MFE shouldn't scale with attack speed, right? It's like, oh, well, I don't think that it is correct that if you already have a spell that is going to generate a movement advantage, that spell should scale over game time in such a way that you get more movement advantage on people as the game progresses, right? Because you're already doing that when you buy attack speed. You're already standing still less time to attack, right? And so you're already gaining that movement advantage. We don't need to double down on that. So what about Q? Q is more related to the question I was talking about in one of my previous Q&As, which was, I think that it is good for Varus that his builds are very differentiated, right? If you want to get an instant Q out, you can already do that. You can just tap it and it goes out instantly, right? The Q charge time scaling down with attack speed is that idea is something I don't really like because we want his builds to be different, right? We don't want attacks like on hit Varus or like crit Varus even to be getting similar levels of power out of his Q or even 80% the power out of his Q at 25 minutes as lethality Varus, right? We want there to be very different builds where attack speed Varus is much more likely to tap cast his Q just to pop blight stacks, right? And just keep attacking, right? Conversely, lethality Varus is basically always going to charge Q unless it's going to kill someone or unless you're going to kill someone or like get immediate value out of it. Because that's where a lot of his damage scaling comes from. It makes his builds much more different and it makes sure that they play differently. That Varus Q doesn't scale with attack speed because it gives you very different incentives on how you're using the spell. And one of the things I think is actually good here is that it means the way that you use the spell over game time actually changes. The more attack speed you have, the worse charging Q gets, and you have to make a decision at some point around like, I'm just not going to charge Q anymore unless I can't auto attack them. And at some point, once you have a sufficient level of attack speed, it's I should always attack instead of charging Q. And that like figuring out where that breakpoint is actually interesting, right? And it's a point of mastery for Varus players. I think that's good. The more we smooth out these edges, the more we make it so that there's not anything interesting to optimize around when you're playing Varus and building different items, right? And I don't think that that's actually good. And so that's kind of my perspective on this is that I think it is correct that Varus Q and E don't scale with attack speed for different reasons. And I think that like Sivir Q as an example, the reason why it makes sense for Sivir Q to scale with attack speed is that her auto attacks scale much harder with her build than her Q does. And so if we don't make it so that her Q scales with attack speed, it eventually becomes a trap to use the spell, which I think is wrong. Whereas Varus Q can always be tap cast. It can't be a trap to tap cast in any, like, well, I mean, it can be a trap to tap cast because charging it would be better. But with attack speed builds, casting, because tap casting is always an option, it can't be a trap, right? Or it can't be a trap to charge it, because you always have another option that you can go for, right? And so, or it can't be a trap that you can't get out of, right? Like, we want it to be correct for you to cast your spells, generally throughout the game. But Varus Q has another option that you can use besides full charging it. And the E is always going to be great, right? Because it still gives you a movement advantage on other people and pops blight stacks and so on and so forth, right? And so that's kind of the breakdown here of how I would put it. All right, we're back. Sorry, I was really hungry, so I went and got lunch. Unlike my first Q&A where I do it at the end. This time I had to do it in the middle because I was just too hungry, and I have too many questions. I have a lot of questions to get through, so it's going to be a while. So yeah, let's get back into it. So I miss items being more complex and stronger. Is my sentiment a minority? And then Old Navori in parentheses here. So how do I put this? I'm not sure that I don't know what the overall sentiment players have on like how complex or strong do they want items to be. And I also don't think that that matters, if that makes sense. That might sound really weird. Like, why wouldn't you care what complexity or power level the items have? The item system is really just a vessel, right, in League of Legends, right? It is a channel through which we enhance champions, right? And so from that perspective, the item system is not there for itself, right? It is not there because we just want to make cool items. I mean, that's what I want to do, right? Like, but that's not actually the purpose. Like, at the end of the day, that's not the purpose of the item system in League, right? The purpose of the item system, at least the primary purpose of the item system, isn't saying it can't have cool things, right? It obviously does. And, you know, I love working on the item system and I love making cool items and, you know, making items cooler and all that, right? But fundamentally, the purpose of the item system is to enhance champion fantasies and to progress champions over game time. And also to like help end the game and, you know, other, you know, associated things, right? But this question kind of like to fundamentally answer this question, right? Or like the core of this question is kind of getting at like thinking that players want a really specific thing out of the item system, which I actually don't think is true. Most players don't care, right? Most players are there for the champ fantasy, right? That's the core of the game, right? Or for the competitive aspect of the game. And in neither case does that prescribe a specific amount of complexity or like power level of the item system. What these things are correlated to are not to what the player wants, you know, in terms of like what they say that they want, because we know that, you know, players sometimes say that they want things that they don't actually want, and vice versa, right? They don't say that things that they really do want. But is more about what level of complexity and power level in the item system is correct to support the gameplay that we want in League of Legends, right? And so when I look at this question, my answer to this is I, from a personal perspective, think that items could be slightly more complex. And like you can see that in the changes that we just made for season 16, right? Like I made, you know, I reworked a bunch of items and made them more complex, right? Like Essence Reaver is more complicated. You know, Umbroglaive is more complex. A lot of the new items I made are you know, moderate to high complexity, right? I mean, look at Bastion Breaker. That thing has so much text on it. So I think that item system could be a bit more complex overall. And I think it could probably be higher power, right? My personal take is I kind of, I would like to essentially go back to the complexity and power level of the item system to pre 14-19. Basically, I think the season 14, like most of season 14, complexity and power level is my take on where I think that items should be. Maybe even slightly complexity up from there, but power level, I think that was really good. And the way that I look at that is that I think that that is a really good, like, sweet spot where I think that when, like, 14-19 as an example, right, this is the patch where, like, a lot of items were simplified, right, like, all of the, like, the ramp mechanic was stripped from Sunfire, What else did we do? We made Horizon Focus into a stat stick. I think number one is we put a bunch of items and we put them, I think, below the bar of interest where they became these just like insanely boring stat sticks. And I think the floor has risen, right? Like the perspective on Sunfire Cape at that time was, hey, Sunfire Cape was an item that just burned nearby people for many years and it was good then, right? But like I think that people's standards for what constitutes an interesting item have risen over the years. And so comparing back to what was cool in season 3 is not necessarily the best way of going about qualifying what makes a cool, interesting item, right? And I think that people's expectations for the depth and interest in the item system are just higher today than they were 10 plus years ago, right? And so from the complexity side of things, that's kind of where I'm at. Of like, I think that people want there's a minimum bar of complexity for items in League to make them interesting. We can violate that in some cases when it's cool enough, right? Like Death Cap is extremely simple, but it's also extremely cool. But I think most items need a little bit of something to them to make them interesting. More so than just like what Sunfire is, as an example, right? And then power is a lot easier to measure, right? We've had different measures of like how efficient should a legendary be, how efficient should an epic item be over the years. I think we're currently a little bit below where I personally like for items. I think the main thing that you get when you change efficiency of items is how much power there is in pure champion kit, like experience scaling versus gold scaling. And how feelable are your legendary item spikes? Like how sharp are those spikes? I personally think that we are a little bit below where I'd like to be for legendary item spikes. But this is the efficiency point that LivePod believes is currently correct. So, and it's like, I'm not saying we're super far off, right? I think we're talking about like 5 to 10% off is the disagreement here. At least that I have with Live of like, I think that legendary should be slightly more efficient. They think this is the right number, and that is their purview. That is part of their domain as the live pod. And so that's where we're at right now. As far as actual sentiment, like I said, like kind of wrapping around to the actual question here, I don't think it matters, and I don't think that most players actually think about or care very much about this, right? This is something you have to consider is like, don't think about the average person that plays League of Legends. Think about the average person that plays League of Legends that is in silver or gold or bronze, right? It's like, this is most of the people that make up League of Legends player base. How often do you think this person thinks about the relative power of the item system today versus 3 years ago? The answer is never. They have never thought about that. They never will think about that. And that's okay, right? It's fine for there to be different levels of interest in different systems based on how invested in the game and how skilled you are at the game, right? Higher skill players are way more likely to care a lot about items, as an example. One tricks are more likely to care a lot about items. And people that have played thousands of games of the same champion are, of course, way more likely to think about items because that's one of the ways that they can interact with the system to change their champion, right? To customize their experience, right? But the majority of players are not in those kinds of situations. They're not thinking about the item system in this way. So my answer, like ultimately to this question, is that I don't think that that there is sentiment here, in the sense that most players just don't think about this very much. All right. So this is a really, really long post talking about like, hey, mathematically, when you buy flat penetration and percent penetration, they basically you get more damage amplification out of them, and talking about like what's up with this relationship and like why is this structured like this, or like essentially like what's going on here. The short answer is that this structure is intentional, right? It actually used to not be this way, by the way. It used to be the opposite, where they were actually less efficient when you stacked them. That was back in season 2. It used to be that flat penetration would apply first and then percent penetration to make them inefficient to stack. And I truly have no idea why it was structured like that originally. I do know why it was changed. It was changed in order to create build paths where you could build both flat and percent penetration and make them powerful together, to make there be some incentive and some synergy between these two stats. And then that was taken later on and spun up into an entire item system, right? The lethality item system, which is a build structure for AD assassins where we say, hey, build some amount of flat armor pen and then at some point in the game, you will definitely buy percent pen or percent shred, right? And that's the build that has existed for AD Assassins, for a long time, right? Since like what, season 5, season 6, something like that. It's been a long time. The synergy is intentional because it allows us to have some light multiplicative scaling for assassins, while we can restrict access to those stats in order to limit or to limit or permit access to that type of scaling for other classes as we desire, right? This makes it so that Void Staff is particularly compelling for AP assassins, which we actually think is good. That Void Staff ends up usually being better for them, or more effective overall for them than Deathcap. Deathcap's really expensive; it's hard for them to buy, and so the fact that AP assassins, for example, because they're buying Shadow Flame or Storm Surge, or sometimes both, and so they have some of that flat magic pen. Plus, they have Cirque Shoes a lot of the time. That makes Void Staff more interesting or more compelling for them comparatively to Deathcap, and then the more expensive, more powerful, more slot-efficient item gets to be more preferential to actual mages. That is a good structure, right? And so basically, this mathematical fact, right? It's not really about like how big is the relationship, or it's just math, right? It's just it is what it is, right? Like the actual like thinking here is just, how do we leverage this relationship in order to get builds structured the way that we want? We base the whole AD Assassin build around this synergy. Collector, for example, is actually like part of the reason why Collector isn't the most stat efficient item out there, is because it has access to this flat penetration, which is an exotic stat for AD carries, and also has a lot of synergy with the LDR, or the mortal reminder, that they're going to be getting later on in their builds, right? Anyway, to sum up my thoughts on this topic, it's an interesting topic, mathematically speaking. For those of you who are interested, and you can take a look at the math that was shown out here in the question on my Discord. But it is true that when you build flat penetration, or like, this is the way that I look at it, even though it's also true the other way around. The way that I look at it is, the more flat penetration you have, because flat penetration tends to be much better in the early game, the more incentive you have to build percent penetration. Because there's this powerful synergy between them, right? And there's also an unrelated synergy. I guess maybe it's not unrelated. It's a sort of adjacent synergy that is, the more flat penetration you have, the more powerful it is, right? This is a reward for stacking it, right? Again, this is what leads down the path of the AD Assassin lethality build path, right? Again, the AD Assassin lethality build path is entirely based around this, which is really interesting. And yeah, all I can really say here is, like, these things are true, and we structure the item system around them. I don't really have an opinion on, like, is the synergy too powerful or not powerful enough? Because it's like, well, it doesn't really matter, because if it was, we could just change the items to fit this, and that's how we've structured the item system to make this make sense. All right. Current state of Hullbreaker. This is one which is just asking about, like, hey, is this in a good place now that Crystal and Overgrowth exists? Like, does this make sense? Something I'll note is that Hullbreaker today is really more about the the unique stat line it offers, and the fact that it's a health on hit item. In some ways, right? Like, Aurelia really likes this item. It is factually, it helps you kill towers better, right? It's good for that, right? Don't get me wrong. But Hullbreaker is less. Sorry, let me reframe. The original Hullbreaker was intended to exclusively about split pushing and killing turrets. The current one is not that, right? The current one is, this is an item that is baseline functional if you're in champion combat and you never wanted to interact with a tower. It is also, as a bonus, you get some good stuff that works when you're sidelaning or when you're hitting a tower. Cool, right? And so my perspective on Hullbreaker is, I think it's fine and functional, and maybe it could use a retheme, to be honest with you. I think it's like, the theming, I think, really throws people off, of like, yeah, especially given the original version was so indexed into hitting turrets. But I think let's let this sit for a couple of months and see what happens with Hullbreaker. Is the turret damage sufficient still, right? Is the item in a good place? Because from my perspective, I think it's fine, right? If this item helps you, like, is it an item that's a part of some champions' build paths frequently, like Kled or Aurelia or whatever, because they like the stat line and they like the effect for PvP. And then they sometimes get adjacent benefits for PvE, right, against turrets. I think that's fine. I think the state it was in last season was fine, and I don't currently see any issues with it in current game because of overgrowth, but that might change. All right. Question about ultimate haste being healthy, right? Like a lot of champions being tuned around their ultimate cooldowns, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there are some champions whose patterns do get warped by ultimate haste, right? I think that, one of the more interesting examples is Ahri, right? Where it's like, well, Ahri in the past, especially when she was on more heavily indexed into burst builds, blowing her ultimate, like her first ultimate was a really important window, right? Like kind of like Rengar, for example, where it's like, oh, you really want to get a lot of value out of this first ultimate to get that cooldown ticking for value and then like get, start snowballing, getting ahead, right? Because Ahri at the time was also very snowbally, right? I think Malignance has washed that out a little bit. Obviously, pre-Malignance, she wasn't like she was like the pure burst mage, right? She was playing more like more DPS-y builds at the time. But anyway, so does ultimate haste have costs? Like, are there costs to have this in the game? In terms of we have to tune some champion kits differently, and some champion strengths and weaknesses manifest differently. Yes, that is true. However, I don't think that makes ultimate haste unhealthy, because that's true of almost any powerful thing that we can have in the game, right? Like I was talking earlier about Trinity Force, and how it's like we have to tune some champions around Trinity Force, because if you can use the attack speed, it's a massively over-efficient item, right? And that's okay, because we think Trinity Force is worth that cost. I think we've kind of determined at this point that we think that ultimate haste is interesting enough and compelling enough as a stat that we can offer on a number of items. At this point, we have 4 items. We have Malignance, Fiend Hunter Bolts, Zeeks, and Hexplate. So we have 4 items now that give ultimate haste. And I think that is a, number one, compelling enough fantasy for a lot of champions that care a lot about their ultimate, and also a clear enough window for empowerment, right? Like, hey, I get a cool thing after I ult is very, very interesting and I think compelling for a good number of champions, such that it's not breaking the game. And while it definitely has a cost in terms of how we tune champions around these items, so does almost everything else interesting that we do in the item space, right? And so, to me, I think it's totally healthy. I think it's totally fine. All right, so this is a set of questions about why isn't there like true armor, like armor that's not mitigatable, and adaptive armor, which would be like adaptive force, where it adds to your highest one. So adaptive armor is, I think, a simpler topic. So let's cover that first. This one I think is just largely not an interesting stat. Number one, if it's just like raw, like how much of like which one is higher, you'll always get armor because you just almost always have more armor than MR. It takes a lot of work to get more MR than armor, and it's very, very, very rarely useful. If it's relative gold value in inventory, that's not very interesting because armor and MR are not the same kind of stats that AD and AP are. AD and AP are about scaling how your champion works. Armor and MR are reactive stats. You are reacting to your opponents. And so having an adaptive resistance item, I think, maybe we could have one, but having a stat for it doesn't really make sense. I think we could have an item that like adapts to the damage you've taken. In fact, I actually had an item that I tested at one point that had like something similar to Camille passive on it. I think that's totally reasonable for a single item, right? But adaptive armor as a stat, I think is like kind of deeply uncompelling, because it's just like, get more of the thing that you have. Even if we say like it's based on the items that you have in your inventory, it's just like, okay, so I build an armor item, and so this is an armor item. And if I built an MR item first, now this is an MR item, which by the way is like actually not good, because you almost never want multiple MR items in your inventory, right? So I just think adaptive resistance as a stat is just not interesting and not useful for the most part. An item that leverages something in that space, like a singular item, could be fine, right? Like I think could be cool, but not that interesting. Because it's not about how your champion personally performs, right? Like we're not going to get some super awesome, interesting thing out of, oh, we made 2 items with adaptive armor, or we like made an adaptive armor stat, and that's super interesting for Galio and Malphite. It's like, no, it's not. Let's just give you both resistances, right? Like conditioning, for example, right? Like we wouldn't want to make conditioning have adaptive resistances, it's better if it just gives you both, because then it can give you a multiplier that actually is like compelling over the course of game time and all that, right? And isn't super specialized into indexed. It means that you don't have to specialize against one singular damage type. You just get more durable, specific, like more, more durable when we give you both resistances on like conditioning or jack show or whatever. All right, let's talk about true armor though. So this is basically like about like resistances that aren't mitigatable. And the answer is that we have had these in the game before, specifically on the old Force of Nature. There was not on the super old Force of Nature, but I think like 2 Force of Nature iterations ago or 1 Force of Nature iteration ago. There's a version of Force of Nature that at maximum stacks would give you % magic damage reduction. We have this in the game, right? It's actually a stat, by the way. It's not even something that we're just doing in script, which is how a lot of our things like that work. It's actually a real stat in the game. It's magic damage reduction, and physical damage reduction also has one. Casted and passive also currently still has this on live. Why don't we use this more, or why don't we have this on like items or anything, right? So the first stop here I will say specifically is that number 1 is actually really important that damage outscales durability in League of Legends, because if durability outscales damage, that means that the default action is nothing, right? Or like the default action is no gameplay, right? Like nothing happens, nothing occurs. And we need the game to end, right? One of the structural reasons why every single MOBA that I personally have ever played, and probably every MOBA that's ever been made that made sense at all, has damage outscale durability in the game, is so that the game will eventually end, right? And you want the game to generally end because of player action. You don't want it to be, well, durability outscales damage, but minion damage scales really hard, and so eventually minions will end the game. It's like, that's not a compelling way to end the game. And so damage outscales durability. This is why there's % penetration, and you can't really mitigate that as a tank, or one of the reasons why that's true. So that's like at a baseline why we generally don't have these mechanics, right? Is that we don't want durability to scale as well as damage overall in League of Legends. And again, like I said, every MOBA that I've ever played has the same structure, because it makes sense for making sure that your games can actually end, and making sure that the default correct action as the game goes on is something that progresses the game, which is killing someone, right? Anyway, let's take a look at the example case of Force of Nature, though. Why was it there, and why did we remove it, and like what happened with it? So what happened with that was that in the Mythic system, we offered mages a different stat profile than what they have today. And we offered them a lot of very, very powerful anti-tank options, right? Liandry's was the primary offender, for sure. Mythic Liandry's was insanely overpowered against tanks, right? It was not only give you damage amp, but based on their health and such, but it also had % max health damage. Demonic Embrace also existed. Void Staff was very powerful at the time. And the stat profile differences, mages had access to a lot more health and a lot more haste in their regular build paths, right? Without actually even trying, they would be more tanky, and they would have a lot of haste. So they weren't really one-shottable, and they had really, really frequent ability to spam their spells out, right? You would get more haste, you'd have more health. Like even Shadow Flame at the time had health on it, right? So the introduction of MR, % magic reduction Force of Nature was a response to, hey, mages are actually kind of fighter-like now. They have so much health and so much haste and so many anti-tank outputs that mages were actually incredibly good. Like AP champions in general were too good at killing tanks. And so the magic damage reduction Force of Nature was an emergency release valve for like, hey, tanks need an answer to the overabundance of answers to my class that this other class has. That was what happened there, right? And if you ever heard me talk about these kinds of situations before, my preference is, or like my statement is always, if you're getting into counters of counters in your systems, you've probably gone wrong somewhere, right? Like when people start having to counter counters, right? Like imagine we had a stat in the game that's like anti-grievous wounds. It's like, oh, this gives you minus 20% grievous wounds, and now we make grievous wounds up to 60% because someone can minus 20% of the grievous wounds. We have to keep spiraling this out of control. No one is happy at the end of the day, right? Like it's much better to just have thing and counter, in my opinion, in almost every system I've ever seen. Because when you start getting into counters of counters of counters of counters and so on and so forth, right? You start getting like lost in the sauce, I think, in the systemics, and you end up in situations where, well, if any of your foundational assumptions around like, oh, what about it if a mage buys Ludens and then goes for a, you know, a build that for whatever reason doesn't have that high amount of haste that, you know, the mage system generally has. Oh, well, they're going to be like not just incapable of interacting with a tank, it's going to be like impossible for them to even look at them, right? And so you end up with these really, really, like when you start layering counters, you create these really, really, really sharp interactions, and you also tend to make it so that it becomes more and more necessary for people to opt into each step along the way, because each step counters the, you know, the following step, and then you make it so that that's just the default, right? And I think that's generally undesirable for a number of reasons. So in general, talking about this topic, I really don't like the idea of percent magic damage reduction or percent physical damage reduction unless it's a part of a champion kit where we want to tune that, right? Like, I think outside of the system space, this is totally reasonable. Like, Cassid and passive having it is totally fine. If we wanted to give Malphite percent physical damage reduction, or Galio, you know, percent magic damage reduction, which I guess he has, I think that's totally reasonable, right? From a champion kit perspective, we don't start getting into these layered levels of counters. It's like, if we just want Malphite to be better against physical damage, sure, why not, right? Like, that's totally fine. We can tune him around that. The problem with having these effects in systems is that they start layering into these like counters of counters of counters of counters things. And like I've kind of described here, I just don't think that those situations are good for anyone. All right. How do you think the game would change if Riot stopped providing us with stats like win rate, percent of champs? This is something I've been talking about a little bit recently. I was talking about this on my stream, I think, last weekend, and I've been thinking about it some recently. It's like, I generally think that the game would probably be better overall. Or if data was limited to certain certain limited windows of opportunity of like, hey, the season has ended. Over the course of the entire season, this was, these, like the top, like here were the top 5 champs and here were the bottom 5 champs or whatever, right? Like maybe stuff like that could be good. But I think in general, while the data can be used really effectively to do some really interesting things, like people could find out sorts of things about the game. People have access to information that can help them like optimize their gameplay, or like optimize item builds, or optimize their picks in certain situations, etc., so on and so forth. Overall, I think that the total sum experiences that people have because this data is publicly available are largely negative, right? Like, look at that Hwei question from earlier today, right? Like, I don't know if the person asking me about Hwei at 49% win rate when they're saying like Hwei is weak, are they actually saying Hwei is like weak factually, which is not really true, or are they like saying that Hwei is like feels bad? Because there's a huge gap between something is like factually weak or factually too strong or whatever, and it feels weak and feels too good, right? There is a gap there. And at the end of the day, I personally do believe it does matter factually that things are balanced, but there's a range there, right? And there's a range of like what feels good versus what is balanced, right? And there may be some things where, hey, this can be balanced from 49% to 52%, but it really only feels good if it's 51% or 52% or higher. And so then it's like, okay, that can be really tough because we can balance the thing, but when we have that data publicly available, it can be hard to tell what people are like, what feedback we're getting are because people literally looked on a stats website that said their champion was bad or whatever, right? Versus what is actually like real feelings that people have. But I don't know. I think the ship has maybe sailed on this one. I'm not saying that I would like push for us to change this today. I just look at this and I say, it's obviously impossible to tell, right? Like there's so many things that come from data, but I look at it and I say, like, I think the sum total of having that data publicly available probably wasn't good. This question was about tiers and mana / scaling items, and like how mana ratios feel low, and talk about stacking the same item. So stacking the same item thing, this is something I floated as an idea for season 14, and the QA on my project may have threatened my life. The short version of this is like, it's something that would be cool. I think being able to stack the same item is like it's kind of something I look at as being very similar to like the tier stacking thing that I enabled in this season. Is like, we don't generally want this to be optimal, and it probably wouldn't be very often. And I think if the QA cost was really low, like if it didn't take an enormous amount of validation and extra work to make it work, I would have enabled it in season 14. Because it's a lot of extra work to maintain that system, because QA have to test every single item stacking, like how it stacks with itself, and we have to validate every single thing working and stack how they stack with other items when you have multiples of them, etc., and so on and so forth. It's a lot of extra testing complexity for minimal value, is what we found. Is just like, it would be cool. Maybe at some point we'll have a better way of testing items, or a better way of doing the QA there. But currently, it's like, it was disabled for a few reasons, but I think the main one that's holding us back today is just like, well, we just don't think that it's worth the price that we would pay in terms of like QA time. We'd rather spend that time elsewhere. As for the rest of the question, talking about like tier and like the mana ratios on items, I tend to agree. Some of them, especially, I think are maybe a little low. Like, one of the things I was noticing, I've been playing around with these multi-tier builds recently as well, is like, I think like the mana ratio on Seraph shields, like I would expect when you have a few mana items, the Seraph shield should just be like ridiculous, right? Like, it should just pop up and be, everyone should be like, wow, that guy's invulnerable, right? That's kind of the payout I'm expecting, and it's not quite there. So I tend to agree. Maybe the mana ratios are a little too low. I don't know. It's not something I've dug super deep into, but I tend to agree that like maybe the mana ratios on some of these items could be higher. I will say one of the dangerous things is the stat conversions can be incredibly dangerous to go too hard on here, right? Like, this is something where I suspect if we were buffing the mana ratios, it probably wouldn't be like the mana to AP ratio on Seraphs, especially because there's a dangerous quadratic scalar here where heal and shield power scales AP ratios, right? There's a lot of shields that have AP ratios and heals as well, right? So one of the dangerous things that we could do is introduce a like hard locked build of like, if you build archangels, or if you build Whispering Circlet, you have to build archangels, or it's way more powerful to build archangels or whatever. I wouldn't want to hard lock those items together, and so I'd be wary of those ratios specifically, like the heal and shield power ratio on Whispering Circlet, and then the AP ratio on archangels. But the other mana ratios I could see being higher. That seems like it could definitely happen at some point. All right, so this was a comment about, hey, Janna E gives AD and Lulu W gives attack speed, and these effects could adapt to their target and like give different stats based on who they are. I actually am not a fan of this idea. The reason why is I think it's actually a positive that we have additional context to consider on certain enchanter spells, right? When you give Lulu W, it gives move speed, which is useful for everyone, and attack speed, which is useful for most champions, but not everyone, right? And that gives context on like when you would or would not want to cast it on different people, which I think is interesting because especially with the shields, like Janna Shield is maybe a better example, where if there's no other context on the shield, Janna is actually heavily encouraged to shield frontliners, right? Like, they're much more likely to take damage, and they're likely to have more resistances, so the value of her shield is multiplied, right? And so having a reason to cast your shield on a squishy, I think, is a positive. Having a reason to cast a shield on every squishy, I think, is a negative in terms of like, hey, I think it's interesting if Janna has some extra factors to consider with her shield besides just literally, who do I need to give temporary health to? I think that ends up being a positive for the people playing champions like Janna and champions like Lulu, where they can learn and have deep master around like where, like when and why they're casting their spells, right? Like Karma E, I think, is a really interesting example of this. Of like, obviously later in the game you just spam RE, which is not the most interesting, but in like some of the earlier skirmishes, if you don't have your R up for your E, like deciding who you're going to cast your E on, who's going to get the movement speed and the shield, I think is actually a really interesting point of mastery for Karma players. And so the fact that these bonuses offer different things to different champions, I think actually ends up being a positive for, hey, this makes it so that the champion, like playing the champion, you have different things to consider when you're looking at, using your spells on different allies, instead of, oh, I use this and I only have to care about the shield, or I only care about the movement speed on my Lulu W or whatever, because the rest of the benefits are so like powerful for everyone. Having it be more powerful on certain targets means that there's more interesting questions that you're asking about who this should be used on at any given time, which I generally consider to be a positive for these spells. Now, I do think there could easily be a champion who that's their thing, right? Like they get different effects based on who they're casting their spells on. I can imagine an enchanter that does that, and that could be a really cool hook for their kit. But I think in general, it's good for enchanters to have different outputs and different reasons to cast their spells on different targets on their team. Thoughts on a Cull for power farming junglers? I don't particularly like Cull as a standalone, like random item that you buy on, first base. I think Cull would be much more interesting as a starting item, and from that perspective, I don't think it makes that much sense for junglers, because I don't actually think we want an item for junglers that says, get a really powerful payout after you farmed a lot, because that's kind of how we already structure the jungle. You have a jungle pet that evolves and gives you an effect when you fully evolve it, and that's a part of your reward for farming a lot, is that you get that reward earlier comparatively to junglers that are ganking a lot, right? We already sort of innately have this structure in the jungle, and so I'm kind of skeptical of layering additional things on top of this. I don't think we need additional incentives or like build structure incentives to tell junglers to power farm. And so for that reason, I'm not really like super compelled by the idea of a jungle Cull. This is a question about mythics. How much of, or a problem, how much of it was on their stats? The answer is like, in some ways, some, and in some ways, I think the ways that matter is the answer is none. What I mean by none is that mythics had to have more stats structurally than other items in order for them to make sense. What was the problem with mythics was their structure, right? Was that they were items that were intended to offer choice and be in early slots. Deriving from those things, they must be more powerful than other items. And that means they have to be statistically more powerful. And so, like, essentially what I'm getting at here is that stats are not the first order problem. Like, they're a symptom of the deep-rooted issues of the mythic system. The stats on them were essentially not relevant, right? Because the actual problem was, well, yeah, we structured a system in that you have to buy a mutually exclusive set of choices early in your build, preferably first. That's the problem. And that structure means that your item has more stats on it, right? But the problem itself is not derived from the stats. This is like asking, you have an ant infestation in your house, and you're like, well, how much of the problem is that, that there's ants in my living room? It's like, well, I mean, that's part of the problem, but like the problem is that you left a bunch of food out and the ants are going through your living room to go to your kitchen because you left a cake on the counter or whatever, right? I was like, well, yeah, I mean, ants being in the living room, I guess, is like part of the problem technically, but it's not really the origin of the problem, right? It's like that's like it's just part of what the problem, like it's part of the underlying set of conditions that cause the problems with mythics, right? That's how I would view that. All right. What goes into deciding if the center of my spell needs to be within my cast range or any part of it? So center versus edge is something that by default, attacks are edge to edge, and spells are center to center. And missiles are typically fired from the center, your 0 point. Those are the defaults. And so that's how most spells work. Anything that is different from that, anything different from what I just said, typically means that someone has changed the default behavior for a specific reason, right? As an example, tethers today use edge to edge. Almost all of them did before I did my tether update in 2024. I think I did that. Yeah, I think it was 2024. Except for Zach Q, which now uses edge bounding. And the reason for that is that when you have a tether attached to someone, their center point crossing the line is not what people expect to break it. They expect when the model is outside the line, that's what will break it, on both, like from both the person playing it and outside perspective. And so most of the things we like, instances where we change these from the default behavior of spells, it is because something about the spell, like the way that it looks, the way that it plays, something about it was violating player expectations. But by default, most spells are center, right? Like most spells just say like, did I hit your center or not? Or did I hit some part of your box or not, right? Or sorry, I shouldn't say most spells are center to center. Let me rephrase. missiles can hit any part of a player's model, any part of a player's bounding box. But spells that directly target players by default require targeting their center. So like you have to be just as close to a gigantic Cho'Gath as you have to be to a really small Tristana or whatever, right? Sorry, but so that's how things work by default, and anything else is just something felt off or something was off about the spell, and so it was changed. Why is Aphelios being pushed more towards a more auto attack playstyle rather than a caster one? There's a number of reasons here. One being that the original intent and design of Aphelios was that he was going to be an auto attacker who cycled through guns and used these interesting attack effects of his guns to greater effect, and that he was going to focus more on the attack effects of his guns than on his spells. Right. That's why he's allowed to, very very quickly after he swaps guns, cast new spells, is because it was intended that his spells weren't going to carry crazy amounts of power like they currently do. Or they were intended to carry less power than they currently do. I mean, there was originally intended to be more power in like the on attack effects, right? Like the extra range on Calibrum and the, splash fire damage on Infernum and so on. Over time, things have changed, right? We majorly shifted him towards caster builds when we gave him lethality on his E rank up instead of the original stat that he had there. And because we majorly shifted him towards caster, like for what it's worth, I think we would have accepted him being a little more castery from his release state. But we shifted him really far. Like if you imagine there's a sliding scale of this side is pure auto attacker Aphelios that doesn't care very much about his spells, and this side is like pure caster Aphelios doesn't care at all about his attacks, or like only attacks like once or whatever. He was originally like, somewhere in here, like he was only a little bit castery. And with the lethality change, we moved him like way over here, like way closer to this than they were comfortable with. And over the years, we've tried to shift him back more towards where we wanted him as like an auto attacker, back towards this side of caring more about his auto attacks. Because part of what is interesting about Aphelios as a guy wielding a bunch of different guns is that he can attack you with different guns and do interesting things, right? When he's only casting his spells, that makes him less interesting and less unique in a lot of ways because, well, there's lots of AD carries that can cast their spells on you. And sure, maybe he has more spells that are a little different and they combine in weird, interesting ways. And I think that can be good, right? Like, I'm not saying he's, completely terrible as a caster. It's just, he's at his, like, we believe he's at his best when he is less of a caster than currently. Not saying he has to be, your spells are nothing, right? Another thing that is also problematic here is like just the amount of damage thresholding. Like Aphelios R does a lot of damage. It should do a lot of damage, but some of the spell combos he's gotten up to do, what we think is probably not correct levels of damage for the type of champion that Aphelios is in terms of burst, right? It's like when you have, a bunch of crit items in your inventory and you have real DPS, there are limits to how much burst you can deal, or you should be allowed to deal. And Aphelios for sure in the past has violated that when, especially I think with Gale Force, but like, Gale Force QR, QR combos and like Caliber Mark combos. Like one of the reasons why Caliber Marks can be really powerful is that it's ostensibly supposed to be an auto attack. You're supposed to be paying for part of that power of like, well, you're supposed to have attack speed. And so like your auto attack isn't just like blasting people. But if you only build AD, you never invest into any attack speed, you go full caster. Caliber Marks get probably more powerful than they should be. In fact, I would actually argue that like we probably should make Caliber Marks scale with attack speed in some way and nerf their base values such that building attack speed, you can still get a lot of value out of the Caliber Marks, and Caliber Marks are not like 40% more powerful on builds that don't have any AS in them because you have full AD, lethality and armor pen builds, right? So that's like the underlying reasons. I will say that I don't know if like, I'm not saying any of this stuff is like set in stone, but these are just general thoughts that have been had for Aphelios over the years. But for sure, it's possible that Aphelios could be more castery or more attacky than he is on live. And I don't have like a super strong read on like, do we need to like hard push him towards one side or the other currently? I don't know. My perception has been that he's like the lethality changes put him so far towards caster that a lot of our changes have been trying to pull that back a bit. but I don't have a super great read on the exact current state of Aphelios. What's the point of using LP as a reward/punishment if your internal MMR is really what matters? Qualifier before I get into this is not the kind of thing that I work on. I'm not a matchmaking designer. I'm not a meta systems designer. I'm not the kind of designer that works in this thing. But the simple explanation is basically that the human brain isn't very good at recognizing certain types of divisions, right? Like the human brain is much more excited to hear that they have gotten promoted to Diamond 3 than that they have reached 2,300 ELO, right? The generic number, like, and you can look this up. There's been a lot of studies done on this. People are just happier if they have a more regimented experience. And so LP is designed to create an experience that is more satisfying to progress through than just showing you your MMR or your ELO or whatever, right? Now, you could say, well, what about a system where you're shown your MMR, but there's also that secondary system? And that's generally largely like less satisfying, is like the actual core of it. And so a lot of this just comes down to the system is intended to be as like, it's intended to make the system more satisfying and reduce ranked anxiety. And it does both of those things. Is it the best system ever for that? No, I mean, there's probably better systems out there, but I mean, any system could be better, right? So that's like the short answer to this. And I don't really have a great longer bonus answer because I'm just not the kind of designer that works on this stuff. And it's not something I'm an expert on. Has there ever been any attempts to give energy scaling with bonus mana from items? Short answer is I don't think so, not that I know of. I think largely over the years, whenever this topic is like discussed internally, the conclusion pretty quickly is, yeah, we don't care if energy champions can't build mana items. Mana at a default is generally a disadvantage compared to other resources, right? And so mana items being powerful and interesting in ways that are cool for the mana champions is generally considered a positive, right? This is something I talked about in my last Q&A with Actualizer, or at least I think it was the last one. Maybe it was the first one. I don't remember. But we generally believe that we want to make systems that make mana more interesting, to make it feel like less of a punishment to have mana, because we think mana does do some good things for the game. And we don't want to be in a situation where the mana champions feel like their items are better for other champions that don't have mana, because that puts us back to square one of like, oh, well, now you just feel like you're punished for having mana. So that's where we're at here. And I think it's unlikely we would do anything like this, at least in the current item system. Obviously, there are different versions of the item system that could change this, but I think currently we're trying to like increase the amount of system interactions that feel good for mana, and that would go directly counter to that. Are there any champion kits that you personally would want to change but you feel are too iconic? And then it was asking about like other designers as well. I don't know. There's definitely this has definitely come up from time to time, right? This is something that got talked about a lot like 8 years ago with Zeal, for example, where it's like, wow, this champion would probably be so cool for random solo queue players if he didn't have shuffle. But shuffle is like, really, really, really hard for most players to use. Not for them to execute, by the way. I'm not talking about execution. I'm talking about like understanding when and why to shuffle people. Azir is the one that comes to my mind of hearing these discussions. I think over the years we've kind of come around to like, actually, Azir's just a cool champion. He's in pro. That's fine. Like, he's cool in pro. If that means that he's not the best champion out there in solo queue, maybe that's just fine, right? But that's the one that immediately comes to my mind personally, of like, back in the day, I would have said like, hey, I would love to change Azir, but I think it's, the shuffle is just too iconic. We can't do anything about it. These days, maybe I'm more accepting of that. I think other designers are too. I don't know. Maybe it's just fine. But yeah, that's the one that comes to my mind. There are probably others, but not anything that like comes to my mind immediately. This was a make Navori only work on crits instead of all auto attacks, so champs like Volibear can't abuse it. So number one is I wouldn't even really say Volibear buying Navori is abuse, right? Like, it is one of his better items, right? Don't get me wrong. It's very powerful on him, but I think I might have talked about this in a previous Q&A as well. Maybe I did. I don't remember. But I think that Volibear's giving up a lot, right? This is an item that doesn't have any of the stats that he wants except movement speed, right? Attack speed is not very good on Volibear. Crit is terrible on Volibear, right? Move speed's good, right? Don't get me wrong. That one's awesome. But it doesn't have any defenses, right? And it doesn't really scale his damage much. I mean, not directly. Obviously, the passive effect does scale his damage some. But it's a huge trade-off for him. He's very squishy when he buys this item, right? He's paying a very, 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 very high opportunity cost to go for it. So I wouldn't even really call it abuse. I would call it like, unintended use that is powerful. Which like abuse to me suggests that it's like outside the realm of acceptability, which I don't think it is, or that it's far like too powerful to accept, which I don't think that it is. That one's statistically just not true. I don't think Navori only working on crits makes sense at all. For one, yes, we could make it scale with crit, we could make it so that it's a more powerful refund, but that would make it really spiky and load even more variance into crit, which I do not think is desirable for the current game. I think we're kind of capped on how much variance in crit there can be, right? Like as an example, imagine you're Lucian, you go, Essence Reaver Navori, you E into someone, you double tap them, and you don't trigger Navori because you just happen to not crit on those 2 shots. That'll happen, roughly 25% of the time, right? And I think it's pretty expectation breaking, right? Having this cooldown refund be inconsistent based on your auto attacks is really undesirable, right? We want this refund to be something that you can play around and expect. You auto attack, that's an input, you get an output, right? Having a cooldown refund be based on something that is completely out of your control, that is literally just RNG on one of your inputs, is really undesirable because it means the item is probably not possible to play around until you get to 100% crit. And I think this would also push it back in build paths, do a bunch of things that I think are generally not desirable for the item. Now, we could scale the refund with crit. However, I'm not a huge fan of that idea. Like, we could say that the refund is like, the same as it is now or a little bit more powerful when you're at 100% crit. For one, because I think that the power of this item is kind of pushed as it is. And like having it be more powerful at 100% crit is kind of scary to me, just like in terms of like how often Lucian would be dashing and stuff like that. But also because I think this item is at its most compelling as a second or third item, and that would push it back in builds, and I don't really like that idea. So in general, number one, I don't really consider it a problem if Volibear is buying this item, as long as it's reasonably tuned, right, which it is. And I don't think that making it only work on crits is a good solution anyway, even if we didn't want Volibear to buy it. What in design determines the frequency of dot damage? This is an interesting one. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, not all dots in League are created equal. Some deal damage. I think the most common form is they deal damage every 4 times every second. That's the default setup. We have an event called Update Actions that just triggers 4 times a second. So that's like if you just stick it in there, stick the logic in there, that's the default of what will happen. There are a good number of dots that deal damage 1 or 2 times a second. There are a few dots that deal damage 8 times a second, right? This is like Rumble Q does this, for example. I think Brand Passive does as well. There are also other weirder dots that have other intervals. Like I think Darius Passive is like 1.25, which is insane, by the way. And I think it's crazy that it does that, but it seems fine. So I guess we'll just leave it that way. And ultimately, the answer to this question is, how do we want the dot to operate, right? Do we want the dot to be extremely consistent, right? Like Darius Passive, for example, one of the reasons why it might benefit from a longer tick timer is it gives Darius more windows of opportunity to stack Conquer and stack his passive before the damage ticks on his bleed passive. And so you can gain more benefit from gaining AD in the middle of the process, right? Because if you think about it, it's essentially saying it's more backloaded, right? The damage is a little bit more backloaded. And so you get more benefit from gaining AD and scaling the AD ratio on it part of the way through the process. Conversely, something like Rumble Q, we want to be really, really, really consistent because that's his main damage spell. And we want Rumble to be able to understand, and we want Rumble's opponents to be able to understand exactly how much damage it's doing, and we don't want it to be super chunky. And we also want to make sure that there's a proper payoff for like Rumble actually staying and keeping someone in the Q area. One of the things that can be really weird about the lower frequency of updating these and checking these, especially with like area triggers like Rumble Q, is that if someone like moves out of the area, for example, and let's suppose Rumble Q only ticked once a second, someone could be like in the area for potentially half a second and not take damage from it. That's specific to area triggers. But there's definitely some weirdness about this. And a lot of this just comes down to how is it set up, and did we, decide that we needed it to do something else instead, right? A lot of the like mainline dot champions like Rumble and Brand get their special privilege here to deal the damage more frequently so that it's more clear to everyone involved like exactly how much DPS it is. Because if you think about it, it's like the more frequent the damage application is, the easier it is for your brain to understand exactly how much damage you're taking over time and how much damage you're going to take in total. And we think that's generally a positive for the mainline dot champions that are doing a lot of damage with their dots and actually caring a lot about them, right? That's valuable to us. Whereas the other champions, we generally don't consider it as valuable, and so we don't need them to be as frequent. And in fact, in some cases, like with the Darius case, they might actually even benefit from having a longer tick timer or like a lower frequency in order to get more satisfying meteor chunks on the dot. And more opportunities to potentially change what's going on there, if in the case of Darius with like the stacks and all of that. So ultimately, this is one of those things where it's like, well, any dot could really be any number. Like, most dots could be almost any number. It's mostly a matter of like, what other affordances does the spell have, and what considerations did we have when we were making the spell or changing the spell, and deciding like what the frequency of the update should, or what the frequency of the tick should be. Something we'll also note is that you see more numbers the more frequent the updates are, especially with the newer dot tick display that we have. And so more frequency, because it displays more numbers, tends to be a little bit more satisfying. And so that's why some of them are 8 times a second now instead of 4 in that way. Is some of them are literally just because we want to display more numbers for higher satisfaction. Hold on, someone just messaged me on the League client. If you might, I don't know if you heard that, but let me check who it was. Let's see. Not today. Someone's asking me if I want to play Clash. I don't think I'm going to play Clash today. I think I'm too busy. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be... Yeah, I'm going to be too busy. Anyway, let me catch up back up to the video. Oops. I just accidentally minimized this for no reason whatsoever. Wait, that looked kind of weird. What was going on there? Is that just... Okay, well, whatever. All right, let's continue with the video. Sorry, I got distracted by the people asking me if I wanted to play Clash. All right, what happens if 2 champions, GP and an enemy champ, auto a Gangplank barrel on the same tick? So, interesting thing. This is the way that the game works is that events are processed in a specific order. The order at the very bottom, like the very end of the process, like we've gone through all other considerations and we have nothing else to determine it. It is determined by load order. So like as an example, if the blue side is higher on the load order, right? The blue side champions load in before the red side champions, and the red side top laner is typically first in load order, right? So it's typically top, jungle, mid, bot, support, right? So that's the load order by default. And this exact thing can cause weird conflicts if we have like buffs expiring at inexact times and things like this, and like not controlling their ticks and so on. This, for example, the fact that load order was what caused the differences in dot damage for like Rumble and Singed between blue and red side. However, talking about this specific example, I am not sure if this will ever come down to load order. For one, because I believe Gangplank has a lot of special handling for barrels and like when they take damage that I believe means that if I'm not 100% sure about this because I didn't dig deeply into the script, but I believe, at least from last time I was looking at Gangplank barrels, I think that Gangplank has a small advantage in timing where his auto attacks take priority over others if they actually hit on the same tick, which is very hard, right? At least 30 hertz. So that means that both of you hit within a 1/30th of a second window. It's possible. I'm sure it's happened many times on live before, but not that common. So I believe Gangplank has an advantage here. Not 100% sure about it, but if there was no external influence, like from Gangplank's scripts or how his barrels are handled, it would ultimately just come down to load order. And so, if you're blue side Gangplank, you would win, and if you're red side Gangplank, you would lose. So if Gangplank has a really sharp red side disadvantage, let me know and I can take a look into this. But to my knowledge, I don't think that's the case. All right. Will mythics or items like them ever make a comeback, either as a class or individual items? This is tough because I don't know exactly what's meant here by mythics. It's like some of the individual mythics, like in nerfed form or like with different tuning, could maybe come back into the game, right? Like, and we have certain items that are like basically parts of mythics or like pieces of different mythics in the game, right? Like Gore Drinker, for example, is like, okay, well, I don't know if you've seen Ravenous Hydra's active, but it's a lot of the same active, right? It's just we think it's important that that item does not offer you literally everything you could ever want. It probably the item with that active probably can't also make you really tanky and unburstable, right? It can't give you a bunch of health, and so on. And so it's like parts of Mythics could definitely come back. However, as a as an item class, I think is extremely unlikely. I like that's something where it's like it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where Mythics as an item class ever come back, because it's just there are so many individual different not just problems with the individual items, but just problems with the structure of Mythics as a um here is a special item that is more powerful than your other items that is mutually exclusive. That caused so many problems that I really have a hard time imagining we would ever do that again. Nothing's impossible, right? But it's hard for me to imagine that scenario. All right. So items that have downside other than opportunity cost. I was either talking about this on my stream recently or it was in one of the Q&As. I think it might have been the first Q&A. Talking about items that have downsides. This is something we've generally not found to be effective. We have tested versions of this from time to time, but ultimately, items with downsides tend to end up in one of two situations, or items that have like permanent downsides, like minus stats, or like your attack speed is set to this thing, or whatever. They end up in one of two spaces. One is the item is factually good, but it feels bad, right? This is like slow and steady from Arena and ARAM Mayhem, where it's like factually it's powerful. Well, people don't really take it outside of Jace very much, and when they do, they're usually unhappy because it feels terrible to not be able to scale your attack speed, right? And even when we're subtracting a stat that isn't as feelable as attack speed, right? Attack speed is the most feelable stat in the game. It tends to feel pretty bad. Another good example from Arena and ARAM Mayhem is Glass Cannon, which also feels pretty bad. It's satisfaction-wise one of the worst augments I think in Arena right now, or sorry, in ARAM Mayhem. I don't even think it's in Arena. I think it's just Mayhem, right? Anyway, so these typically end up in one of two positions. One of them is feeling bad, even if they are factually powerful. Slow and steady is the best example. The other one is that the downside is completely ignored, in which case the question is like, why make it unless we're just trying to make a system where you try to cheat downsides off your items, right? An example of this would be, suppose we made an item with like minus 100 AP on it. And it's like, oh, well, of course, you want this item on Riven because she doesn't have any AP ratios at all. And it's 10% better than the other items. And so you get to completely dodge this downside. Or, oh, here's an item that has, I don't know, like imagine we had Xerath that roots himself still in the game, right? Like as a basic ability. I mean, I guess he roots himself with Soul, but we have an item that says like, all right, root yourself and deal way more damage for 5 seconds. It's like, well, of course that's going to be good on Xerath. He's completely mitigating the downside. That exact item I think is a little more interesting because at least it's windowed and it's like synergizing with a specific spell. But the ones that are permanent downsides, I think largely end up as either feeling bad or only purchased, like only actually used by champions that completely ignore the downside, in which case is like, okay, well, why is the downside here, right? If you're comparing this to like mechanics like this in roguelikes, right, which I think they make sense there, where it's like, oh, here's a curse, and sometimes you can completely dodge the downside of the curse. That's very different because roguelikes are typically offering you limited selections, right? You can buy anything in the shop though. Items in League are not like items in roguelikes, right? They're very, very different because you have access to every single item in the shop at the same time. You can buy anything and they just cost gold, right? And so looking at these from the perspectives of like, oh, this is really cool when I find this, I find this item in, Slay the Spire, or this relic in Slay the Spire that has a downside that actually doesn't apply to me, or a curse that like actually is beneficial to me, or whatever. It's like these are very different considerations, mainly because you always have access to these things in League because you're buying from an open shop, whereas in various roguelikes, whether it's Slay the Spire or whatever your favorite roguelike is, part of the value of those choices and the interest in being able to ignore those downsides is the context of the rest of your build, and the fact that you don't always have access to those things makes the interest in that effect really high, right? Or like interest in being able to mitigate the downside or ignore the downside really high. And so that's why those things are good and why they're interesting for those games, but not necessarily interesting for League's item system. Ultimately, I think that windowed or limited opportunity costs, like for example, the double mana costs on Mananomicon, those can be interesting, right? Like the item I was talking about earlier with like rooting yourself or whatever, like that could be cool. Like maybe there's a good version of that. I suspect it's probably just too not fun most of the time, and it's only good with things like Zerathol, but maybe that's not true. I have no idea. So like very windowed opportunity costs, I think can be cool, but I think persistent ones and like large downsides that the goal of your the goal is to try to ignore generally don't really work for League's item system for the most part. Okay, so this is a question about like which abilities grant like why do different abilities grant different types of vision and like why do some abilities not grant vision at all, etc. So this is an interesting one. There's a lot of different design philosophies that have been applied to this over the years. Different champ designers have I think very different opinions on this. Different people have different opinions on this of like what spells should or shouldn't give vision. As an example, long ago we removed all of the vision from terrain creation spells. They used to have it. We remove vision from like Gangplank barrels, right? A lot of this comes down to on a case by case basis. What does the champion using the spell need, right? At the end of the day, vision is powerful. It's not the most satisfying power for most champions, but it comes with some satisfaction, right? Like I think that, for example, taking the vision off of Gangplank's barrels was a small satisfaction loss, right? Because you couldn't use them to check bushes, and it's like a small thing that you used to be able to do that you can't now. But I think that power for Gangplank was better placed elsewhere, right? I think that was overall a good change, both in terms of I think that Gangplank probably shouldn't have the ability to check barrels or check brush and vision and such just by placing a barrel there. You can still do it by exploding a barrel chain, but that obviously has a higher cost, which I think is more acceptable. And so on and so forth, right? Or like with Gangplank, I think it was good for him that he doesn't have vision. But largely, this is just what does the spell need? What does the champion need to function, right? Like as an example, Kaisa W kind of has to give vision, otherwise she wouldn't be able to ult to people that she Ws, right? And so you can kind of see an obvious reason why a spell might want to give vision. Zyra seeds probably don't need to give vision, but it feels good that they do, and it's like a powerful thing that Zyra can do that seems fine, right? They don't give that much vision. The plants give a lot more, but the seeds themselves don't really give much, right? Or I think it's the seeds that she places give vision. I don't think the ones that she spawns from her passive give vision, do they? I don't think they do. Someone tell me if I'm trolling. I actually don't know off the top of my head now that I think about it. So maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, largely this is just about the structure of the champion's kit and what their kit needs, what their kit, where the satisfaction of their kit is, and what we want to do with that structure. It's not too complicated, right? It's just like, hey, let's take a look at the kit. How much vision should this spell give? Figure that out, like what do similar spells give, what do similar kit structures give, what works for those champions, what doesn't work for these champions. It's not something that's like, I mean, it's an interesting topic, I think, but it's not something that I have like a ton of like personal experience messing with. So my knowledge of it is pretty general of like, yep, we just look at the kit and see what they need, see what's actually good for the champ, and then kind of go on from there. So I feel like that's kind of a disappointing answer to that question, but sorry, I don't have much better for you in this case. All right. Zeal and ADC attack speed conundrum. This is talking about one of the things I've talked about in the past, which is like it's hard to get AD carries to buy Zeal items these days because there's so much systemic attack speed. Their ask was like, would a Zeal capstone solve this problem, making it so that like there's more reasons to buy attack speed and really powerful item here. So one problem this would immediately cause is very likely this would mean that unless it's mutually exclusive with IE, which is awkward for its own reasons, this would likely cause another locked slot for AD carry builds, which we think that they're probably at capacity or maybe even over on locked slots. It's because they need percent pen, they need Infinity Edge for crit ADCs, and they also have to have a first item. So that really only leaves them with like one flexible slot, right? Which can be a few different items, but preferably as a Zeal item, right? But like if we say you're now locked to the Zeal capstone, that actually doesn't help us that much because then you're only buying the Zeal capstone, right? Which is very awkward. So that's one immediate issue that I have with this pitch. Another issue that I have with this is that how do I put this? Another issue I have with this pitch is that Unless it's a capstone specifically for attack speed, which is kind of strange, because then that has a lot of overlap with the on-hit system, and it's like, okay, well, why aren't the on-hit champions building this, or are they? And then we need to figure out a way to bridge the crit system, or this isn't a Zeal item, and then if it's not a Zeal item, does it even make sense for crit AD carries? Basically, it's like a Zeal item capstone probably gives you a lot of AS in some way, shape, or form, or some power in your attacks, which probably makes sense for on-hit champions. But if it's a Zeal item, it has crit on it, which is awkward for them. And then there's like a bunch of cascading problems that get caused by that. And so I think the conflicts of the idea of a Zeal capstone, it's not impossible to think that this might be solvable, but I think it'd be very awkward and potentially leads down a road where you need to like completely reshape the on-hit system to make this work for you, which is awkward because like you're reshaping it to fit something that's not even in their system. That's very awkward. So I'm kind of skeptical of the whole idea of the Zeal capstone, not because an AS capstone is bad, but because it specifically being a Zeal capstone feels very awkward to me in terms of the structure of both the on-hit and the crit system. And so that's kind of my like ultimate answer to this is just I'm looking at it and I'm having a hard time seeing the vision, if that makes sense. Or not seeing the vision, but like seeing the good version of the end result is what I'm saying. Like it's hard for me to imagine this working out without a bunch of other very awkward affordances like changed in other systems and like change with the rest of the system like to make this work. And I suspect the upside probably isn't worth it. Omnivamp and runes. This was a question about like, hey, could we ever get Omnivamp back in runes? We have like very powerful Omnivamp. I would actually say the changes to Omnivamp make you less likely to get Omnivamp and runes for several reasons. Number one, minor runes only have about 300-ish gold worth of power budget to give, right? Look at like magical footwear. Magical footwear says you eventually get 300 gold plus a bonus, but you're at a disadvantage. You're locked out of buying boots early. So it's around like 300, maybe 400-ish gold worth of power. Omnivamp as a stat, like per point, is extremely powerful. It's very powerful now, especially. It's the most powerful it's ever been, in fact. We don't really have room to give you a lot of Omnivamp. One of the things about Omnivamp is that even small values, like 3%, are factually pretty powerful, but they're not satisfying at all, right? Like low amounts of Omnivamp are not particularly satisfying because you can't see them healing you ever, right? But they are factually pretty strong. This is one of the reasons why I was like, I'm kind of nervous about, why I think that Endless Hunger hasn't caught on super well, even though it's a factually decent item. The small amount of Omnivamp you get based on the item, even though it's factually powerful, is not that satisfying. Anyway, so the main reasons are like, number one, there's a conflict between how much power budget we have on minor runes and how powerful Omnivamp is. Like we just can't give you a satisfying amount of Omnivamp in a minor rune. It's just not going to happen. We don't have enough power budget for it. That's number one problem. Number two problem is that sustain in runes has proven to be deeply problematic, right? This is the reason why the original Ravenous Hunter is not in the game anymore. Or, well, sorry, all Ravenous Hunters are not in the game anymore. It's why we've reduced... Actually, I have a question next after this about Bloodline. Actually, I guess two questions about Bloodline. But why Bloodline got capped at a lower value is that when we offer a lot of sustain in runes, it kind of breaks a lot of build paths, right? Bloodline in particular does this because if we have a lot of vamp for 80 carries available in runes, it invalidates Bloodthirster as an item and it starts breaking down the intended structure of the 80 carry system, where Bloodthirster is supposed to be something that you can buy for sustain, but comes at a trade-off on your crit scaling, right? That doesn't actually work anymore if there's no reason for you to ever buy Vamp. It also means that 80 carries are always unpokeable, and they didn't make a damage trade-off in order to become unpokeable, right? Because they can just vamp off of waves. So generally speaking, that's not just 80 carries. Sustained DPS champions having access to very powerful from Vamp and runes that doesn't have a super high opportunity cost is very dangerous because it means that poke and largely chip trades and trading in the mid to late game become less and less and less relevant, and like chunking someone for 25% of their health with a random spell or whatever, Zig's Q or something, becomes less and less relevant, and that makes it so that those champions have to start doing more and more and more damage, right? Like it's already the case that like Xerath can like one-shot you if he hits you with a Z a lot of the time later in the game, right? He would not have to do nearly as much damage, and we think it would generally be better if it was easier for him to actually chip and poke people out, right? And so a lot of like, and this is not just about artillery mages, I'm using them as an example here because they're the most extreme outliers, but even like random spells that can hit people that just do some damage, right? Like, Oriana QW or whatever that just hits you randomly. That combo has to start doing more and more and more damage, which starts breaking burst thresholds when we have very powerful sustain in the game, especially if it's really accessible. When you don't start making trade-offs to get powerful sustain, we start running ourselves into very risky situations where we start having to buff these poke damage spells and they start turning into burst tools. And it's very bad for these champions a lot of the time. So it's very dangerous. I think Omnivamp and Runes, especially the current Omnivamp, is actually kind of unlikely. Unless it's in very, very, very small amounts and probably accompanied by something else. So I think it's unlikely. And I actually think that the current version of Omnivamp makes it less likely because Omnivamp's even more powerful per point today than it was before. So talking about some questions about Bloodline and Alacrity. So why does Bloodline take so long to stack? The reason why is that we found that when it was stacking more quickly, it was offering too much sustain too early in the lane. Like all of that stuff that I said about like mid-late game interactions, that's more true in the laning phase. It's actually even more important in the laning phase that trading and poke matters, right? And so when the vamp, like when Bloodline was giving like 4 or 5% vamp in lane, it was invalidating a lot of lane interactions, right? Like you would get like auto attacks by Caitlyn, and then 6 seconds later you would have healed over half the damage that she dealt with to you or whatever, right? Made that kind of like poke or chip trade interaction not meaningful, right? It's really important that we moderate how much sustain people have access to, especially when there's not a sufficient opportunity cost, right? Like I think Blade the Ruined King, for example, is like, well, we can cost that appropriately because it costs you a whole item slot, right? You dedicated to that. And we can make trade-offs. It's very difficult, maybe impossible for us to make those proper trade-offs and opportunity costs on minor runes because they're there from the very beginning of the game, and because they have such a low amount of value, and then when we drip feed them over time, they become actually worth overall more stat power, right? Because we drip fed you them over time, which makes them worse, right? So then we have to give you more in total. So that's dangerous. That's why it stacks longer, is we don't want Bloodline to turn on too early in the laning phase and start invalidating like chip trades and poke and stuff like that. And why it gives HP is like similarly to the mid-late game thing, is we don't want to offer you too much sustain from a rune such that we invalidate Bloodthirster and invalidate the structure of the AD carry item system, where the intent is that getting Vamp should come at a trade-off, right? And so the HP is something that we can give. I don't know why HP specifically was chosen as opposed to any other stat, right? It's a good differentiator, I guess. Makes you not get one shot more. That's all fine. But the reason why it's some other stat and not more lifesteal is we didn't want to give you that much lifesteal in one slot, because that will start to degrade the structure of the AD carry item system and make buying Vamp less valuable in the shop, and that was very undesirable. As for why Alacrity gives a base amount of attack speed, this one's pretty straightforward. It was to give better differentiation between Alacrity and Bloodline. Of course, remember, originally Bloodline, when we released Runes Reforged, Bloodline was much more powerful and stacked a lot faster, right? And so in the original structure, it was more important that Alacrity had that base value to make it much more clear. Alacrity was the early game option. But in the modern versions, like maybe it doesn't really need that base value. But in the original structure, that was more important because we hadn't yet recognized all of the problems that Bloodline would cause when it stacked more quickly and when it stacked to a higher value. And so because of that, Bloodline was factually pretty powerful in lane. And so it was unclear to people like, oh, which one of these is better in the early lane? And so we gave Alacrity a base value to make it very clear signaling, this is the early game / laning option. Bloodline is the scaling option for AD carries. But I'm not really confident that it's even necessary these days. I think that the way that we have them structured today, it's probably not. All right. Last question. Oh man, this recording is like an hour and 20 minutes already. This segment is so long. Okay, well, this video is going to be well over 2 hours. I don't remember how long the first segment was, but we're going for a long one today. Okay, last question. Item power on build paths. This is a question around like talking about some of the things I've said about build path and like how build path matters to the strength of the completed item. How like talking about the example I was giving in my previous video of like when we added one ruby crystal to Catalyst, we had to nerf Rod of Ages, afterwards. And we had a whole meta of people building Rod of Ages just because the build path was better, right? The build path matters. So, leading from that, why do some classes get better epics and better build paths than others, right? Why are AD carries the ones that get the most inconvenient build paths in the current game, I would say, at least for first item? There's a lot of things here. The Lost Chapter 1 and the Dirk one are pretty simple and straightforward. Dirk being powerful is because we want AD assassins to spike and be effective before they finish their first item. And we think that that's worth it to trade off some of the power on their completed legendaries to give them some of that power on the epic slot. In fact, I actually personally think we should buff Brutalizer. I think Brutalizer isn't good enough. And maybe even Dirk. Maybe Dirk isn't quite good enough right now. But I think that AD assassins, I think, need to spike earlier in order for their patterns to make sense and also to make them different from other champions, right? Just having different texture to different item systems, I generally think is good and a positive, that different item systems spike at different times and offer different types of power and all of that kind of thing. I think that's good because it means that, you load into a game with, 2 assassins. That's a really, really, really different game from loading into a game with 2 mages in terms of like how the power curves play out over game time, right? That's a positive, right? As for Lost Chapter is there because we've found that mages having a powerful epic that mostly solves out their mana problems is a way that we can get them to feel functional in mid lane without giving them completely insane levels of power once they finish their first item. Is this the best solution? Probably not. Is it a solution that is functional? Yes. This is something where it's a solution that's functional with only some mild trade-offs, which, you could have a debate as to, like, how painful the trade-offs are on having Lost Chapter be one of the strongest epics in the game. In fact, I would actually argue I think it's currently the strongest epic in the game. There are trade-offs for that, right? But it also makes the mages feel functional in mid because from their perspective, it's like, okay, I just have to get to Lost Chapter and then I can start doing my thing. Whereas previous versions of systems where Lost Chapter was either a lot weaker or didn't exist, a lot of this came down to, okay, mages felt like against assassins, they had to finish their first item to start doing their thing, which is really a lot to ask, especially in a world where we're giving, assassins especially, very, very, very powerful epic spikes that make it so that these mages have to play very defensively, and that can feel really, really, really bad. And so a lot of Lost Chapter comes down to feels and less about power. Of this makes mages feel functional, and that's kind of why Lost Chapter exists the way that it does. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we want to experiment of like, what is a world where Lost Chapter is not a really truly insanely powerful epic, and we try to figure out, like, we try to solve mage issues in a different way. I could see that being good. But the Lost Chapter solution works well enough. As for why specifically AD carries have options for the worst ones, it's because there are things that we don't want to give to AD carries for free that we think we can give to them at a trade-off, right? This is like all of your stats on first item. We don't want you doing this literally every single game, or at least not without a real trade-off, not without going through some paying some costs for it. And a lot of that has to do with like the rest of their item structure with like Zeal items and such. I don't want to get too in depth on that because I've talked about that a lot previously. You can look at some of my previous Q&As if you want to hear more about like AD carry item structure. There were some questions I answered about that, but largely it's about AD carries can have these weaker build paths and can have the appropriate trade-offs for the appropriate payoffs for them. And so that's why they end up with those. Something that's been talked about a lot internally as an example of like something we're thinking about in this space is like, was it good to make all of the tank item basics build into the other, like the upper basics, right? Like this would be, should Giant's Belt not build out of Ruby Crystal? And would that be a more satisfying tank system if we could make some of the tank items have worse build paths, right? Not saying we're going to do it or not do it, but it's something that's been talked about as like, well, there are a lot of upsides to this, right? We would give tanks a more mild version of what AD carries have, basically, of like, well, you need to base on 1,000 gold to get this Giant's Belt. Assuming we reverted to the old Giant's Belt. I think there are upsides and downsides to all these different approaches to systems. And
The question is just what are we prioritizing in the item system at any, when we're making changes to it. And so ultimately, I guess my sort of end word on this topic, or like my end sort of statement on this topic would be, we can do anything, right? We could make every build path as smooth and clean as possible. But if they're all the same, they're all going to feel bad, right? Part of having good build paths means that some build paths are bad, right? That context is important for understanding what a good build path even means, right? And so some build paths are going to have to be better than others. Doesn't necessarily mean we need to have, like, if we want to have that context of like what a good, like having good versus bad build paths at all, right? And so whether that value is worth the cost, I think it is. I think pretty clearly, like something like Dirk and for assassins, and like Lost Chapter for mages, kind of showcases we can do some really good things when we have different power levels in different build paths. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we currently have the exact degrees of that correct, or that we have the correct class distribution of build path smoothness correct, right? That's more debatable. So hopefully that's a good closing statement for you. Anyway, I'm gonna call the stream now. I, to be honest, probably should have hopped into the shower and gotten going like 20 minutes ago, but I really wanted to finish this out, so I'll just be late. It's fine. Anyway, thanks everybody for watching, and I will hopefully catch you next time, or maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, that's it. Have a good one. See you next week, maybe.